Most people think they make decisions based on logic. They believe that if the facts are clear, they'll follow the evidence. But something strange happens when numbers come up against a vivid story. The numbers usually lose. Let's say you're watching the news and they run a segment on a child who went missing after walking home from school. There's video footage, interviews with the family, and emotional background music. That one story sticks with you. The next day, you tell your partner, "There's no way our kid is walking home alone." I'd love to invite you to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's incredible to think about how we're all connected through these stories and ideas. If you enjoy these thought-provoking explorations, consider subscribing to Tired Thinker so we can keep bringing you reflective narratives. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let your imagination drift as we delve into the mind-boggling paradoxes and mysteries. It doesn't matter that statistically, the odds of a child being abducted are lower now than they were decades ago. You've seen that one emotional story, and now the stats don't matter. This is base rate neglect. Base rate neglect happens when people ignore general probabilities in favor of specific, emotionally charged examples. The base rate is the statistical average, what tends to happen most of the time. But our brains are drawn to the unusual and dramatic. We latch on to specific events that feel real and vivid, even if they're rare or misleading. Here's a simpler way to look at it. Suppose you hear that 1 out of every 10,000 people gets a rare disease. That's the base rate. You go to your doctor and take a test for that disease. The test is 95% accurate, which sounds pretty solid. Then the doctor says, your test came back positive. You might panic and think, that means I definitely have it. But that's not how probability works. Even with a 95% accurate test, the chance you actually have the disease is still low because the base rate, the background chance of having it, is so small. What you need to do is combine the test's accuracy with the low likelihood of having the disease in the first place. That's hard for most people to do intuitively. Instead, they focus on the test result, the vivid, concrete outcome, and forget the boring background number. This is where it gets risky. In law enforcement, base rate neglect shows up when jurors overestimate the importance of DNA evidence or eyewitness testimony without considering how often those types of evidence are wrong. In finance, investors may ignore broad market trends, the base rates, in favor of a compelling success story about a startup that exploded in value overnight. In medicine, people hear about one person who recovered from cancer after taking supplements and start to believe supplements are more effective than chemotherapy. We've built a world that runs on data, but we still live like stories run the show. And they do, in a way. When someone tells a gripping personal story, our brain's emotional centers light up. We feel connected, moved, and sometimes afraid. That reaction is stronger than our response to a graph or a statistic. The graph is just a shape. The story is a human face. There's also something called the representativeness heuristic, which overlaps with base rate neglect. When we see a specific case that matches our mental picture of something, we assume it's more common than it really is. Think of someone who's tall, well-dressed, and good at speaking. If you're told they went to a fancy university, you might assume they're a lawyer or a CEO. But what if statistically, they're more likely to be a teacher or work in a mid-level office job? Our minds skip the base rate and jump to the stereotype that feels right. Let's bring this to a more everyday example. You hear a story about a plane crash. It's all over the media. You start to feel nervous about flying. But if you looked at the base rate, you'd see that flying is one of the safest ways to travel. Thousands of flights happen every day without incident. You're more likely to be injured in your bathroom than in a plane. But the bathroom doesn't make the news. The plane crash does. Base rate neglect is also one reason conspiracy theories spread. People see a single strange event or coincidence and use that as proof of a hidden agenda, ignoring the fact that coincidences happen all the time. They don't consider the base rate of how often unrelated things just happen to overlap. Instead, they go with what feels shocking or suspicious. It's important to know that base rate neglect isn't about being stupid. It's about how our brains are wired. We evolved in environments where spotting the unusual could mean survival. If you're walking through the woods and see a strange shape, it makes sense to pay attention. Maybe it's a snake, maybe it's nothing. But in the wild, it was better to overreact than to miss a threat. In the modern world, this wiring gets hijacked. We don't just see what's common, we see what's shown to us. And what gets shown is what gets clicks: the rare, the emotional, the shocking. When we make decisions, whether it's about health, safety, money, or relationships, we need to pause and ask, what are the base rates? What usually happens? What does the data say? Not just the headline. It's not easy. Even trained professionals struggle with this. Doctors sometimes overestimate the likelihood of a disease based on a single symptom, forgetting how rare the disease actually is. Judges and juries may be swayed by dramatic testimony, despite statistical evidence pointing the other way. In personal relationships, base rate neglect plays out in how we interpret behavior. You might see someone act distant for a day and assume they're upset with you, but maybe they're just tired or stressed. If you remembered the base rate, how often people just have off days, it might stop you from jumping to conclusions. One way to guard against base rate neglect is to force yourself to think like a statistician, even if it feels unnatural. Ask yourself, how common is this really? If I didn't hear this one story, what would I believe? What does the broader picture look like? Think of it like zooming out on a map. Up close, one bump looks like a mountain. Zoomed out, it's just a dot. Base rates give you that wide-angle view. They don't erase the specific case, but they put it in context. The tricky part is that base rates are often boring. They don't grab your attention. They don't stir up emotions. But if you want to make better decisions, you have to give them weight. You can't let the loudest voice in the room be the only one you listen to. Sometimes the truth is quiet. It comes in averages and probabilities, and it sits behind the scenes while stories take the spotlight, but it's still there, waiting for you to notice. You'd think doing a favor for someone would make them like you more, but the truth runs the other way. Let's say you're in a shared workspace and there's someone you've had awkward tension with. No fights, no conflict, just that weird social fog where neither of you makes the first move. One day, you need a charger. Yours is at home. You ask this person, someone you barely know and don't particularly like, if you can borrow theirs. They hand it over without hesitation. What happens next isn't about the charger. It's about what just shifted underneath. Psychologists call it the Ben Franklin effect, based on something Franklin once noticed in his political life. He had a rival, someone who openly disliked him. Franklin asked to borrow a rare book from this man's private collection. After a short delay, the man obliged. Franklin returned the book with a thank you note. That small act opened a path. The man who once opposed him softened. They went on to build a warm friendship. It doesn't make logical sense. If I do you a favor, shouldn't that confirm you're valuable to me? Shouldn't that be the psychological direction this runs? But here's what actually happens. When I help you, my brain searches for a reason why. I don't think I helped them because I'm generous. I think I must like them. Otherwise, why would I help them? This process is a kind of cognitive dissonance resolution. Dissonance arises when actions and beliefs don't match. If I've acted kindly towards someone I dislike, there's a tension there. The brain smooths it over by adjusting the belief. Maybe I don't dislike them after all. It shows up in the workplace. A manager who asks their team for input, not just to collect data, but to genuinely request help, may unknowingly build stronger loyalty than one who constantly gives out praise. The team members feel more invested when they contribute to something. When someone helps build a solution, they often begin to feel ownership over the people and processes around it. That feeling becomes social glue. Parents sometimes see this in their kids. A child who helps set the table or clean the dishes starts seeing themselves as a helpful part of the family, not because they were told to feel that way, but because the act of helping rewrites their own self-perception. They like being helpful. They like the people they help. The Ben Franklin effect runs deeper than social trickery. It reveals something about the human need for consistency. We don't like to feel split between who we are and what we do. If we find ourselves doing something kind for someone, the simplest way to square that circle is to believe they're worth helping. Liking someone is easier than thinking you made a mistake in judgment. There's an odd flip side here. The more someone tries to win approval by overgiving, the more likely they are to be devalued. If I constantly do favors for you, it doesn't necessarily mean you'll like me more. In fact, it can make me seem desperate or low status, depending on the context. But if you do a favor for me, your own brain will start doing the emotional math. Perhaps this person is worth my time, worth my trust. Even if you didn't feel that way before, it has quiet implications for conflict resolution. If you're in a strained relationship, asking the other person for a small, manageable favor, not as manipulation, but as a genuine act, can chip away at emotional distance. Asking for someone's help allows them to shift how they see both you and themselves. They are no longer just frustrated, guarded, or neutral. They are now someone who helped you, someone who supported something, even if only a little. It also reframes how we think about influence. We tend to believe that power lies in giving. Give advice, give support, give opportunities. But receiving well, asking wisely can be just as powerful. When someone gives to you, their view of the relationship begins to evolve. They aren't just observing your value from the outside, they've now invested in it. The effect doesn't mean that asking for help guarantees affection. It's not magic. It works best when the favor feels personal, specific, and reasonable. A request that makes someone feel respected, not exploited. A one-time ask, not a burden. And the real shift doesn't happen when they say yes. It happens after, when they reflect on what they did. It matters how the request is made. If it's too transactional, it can backfire. If it feels like manipulation, it breeds resentment. But when the request feels natural, like an invitation to connect, it opens a door. People don't always need praise or rewards to feel bonded. Sometimes they just need to feel useful, needed, trusted. We often forget that people like to help when the stakes are low and the gesture feels meaningful. Helping is satisfying. It tells a story about who we are. And once someone tells that story, I helped them, it doesn't take much for the next line to be because I care about them, or because I respect them, or simply because I like them. That's the mechanism. A small action creates a narrative. That narrative reshapes emotion. Emotion becomes perception. And perception becomes the new baseline for how two people relate moving forward. In settings like therapy, the effect comes up in subtle ways. A client who supports another group member during a session often ends up feeling more connected, not just to that person, but to the group as a whole. It's a shift in perspective built on action, not theory. And outside of therapy, it's everywhere. In classrooms, students asked to tutor others often improve their own learning and begin to feel more confident socially. In friendships, asking someone to share a secret or take your side in a debate can create a bond that wasn't there before. Even asking for advice, especially when done with sincerity, can draw people closer. Not because the advice is useful, but because it affirms a social role. You're someone whose opinion I trust. There's a certain dignity in asking for help that we forget. We think it shows weakness. In truth, when done thoughtfully, it shows respect. It offers someone a chance to step in, to participate, to matter. And when they take that chance, their own mind will help them believe it was the right call, that you were worth it. So next time you're trying to build trust, connection, or goodwill, don't just give, ask. Not because you want to exploit the Ben Franklin effect, but because you understand how people work deep down. Helping makes us feel closer. Helping rewires how we feel. Helping changes who we believe we are, both to ourselves and to others. And in that rewiring, something as small as a loaned book, a shared charger, or a quick favor can change everything. You're walking through a parking lot and spot a stain on the concrete. It looks like a dog. Not just any dog, maybe even your dog. You pause, tilt your head, and stare for a second longer. Then you smile to yourself and move on. Nothing strange about it, right? But here's what's really happening. Your brain is doing something it has evolved to do very well, even when it's not needed. It's spotting patterns in random data. That's the clustering illusion. This trap plays on your brain's need to make sense of chaos. It sees a loose scatter of information and starts forming shapes, relationships, and stories, whether they exist or not. From a survival standpoint, it made sense. Our ancestors benefited from recognizing faces quickly, detecting threats in bushes, or noticing movement in patterns. Over time, this ability became hardwired. But now, in our modern environment full of data, noise, and coincidence, that same wiring can lead us off course. Take lottery numbers. People often believe that certain sequences are more likely than others. A pattern like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 feels suspicious or too neat, even though it's just as likely as any other set of 6 numbers. The numbers don't know what came before. Still, players might avoid such combinations because their brains scream that it looks wrong. That's the clustering illusion. It convinces you that patterns mean something when they're nothing more than chance. You've seen this in sports too. A basketball player sinks 3 shots in a row, and the announcer says she's on fire. The hot hand fallacy kicks in. Viewers and even coaches start believing she has a higher chance of making the next shot just because the last few went in. But statistically, unless she's changed her form or position, her odds are the same as they were before the streak. The clustering illusion steps in and tricks even experienced professionals into seeing trends that don't exist. The same thing happens in business. You're reviewing sales charts. There's a dip in February, then a rise in March, then a slight drop in April. You might feel tempted to draw a line through these points and explain the changes, seasonal effects, holidays, promotions, maybe even the weather. But if you zoom out, you might see that the fluctuations are just noise, part of a wider flat line. Still, your brain wants to find a reason. It wants to link the dots. It hates the idea that things might be random. Look at crime maps. A cluster of red dots shows where incidents happened last month. You zoom in on a block with a few pins close together and start to think it's a hot zone. You might believe the area is getting more dangerous, but unless the data is dense and tracked over time, the clusters could be meaningless. Random events will form clusters sometimes. It's a feature of randomness, not a bug. The trap here isn't just in seeing patterns, it's in acting on them. When people fall into the clustering illusion, they make decisions based on false connections. They avoid streets because of a few random crimes. They buy stocks based on short-term patterns. They blame specific actions for unrelated outcomes. Over time, this creates a distorted view of reality. People start treating randomness like it's destiny. They miss out on what's actually driving the outcomes they care about. Let's bring it closer to home. You scroll through your phone and see that 2 friends posted about feeling sick. Later that day, you feel a little off. Your mind makes the leap. Maybe there's something going around. It could be true, but it could also be coincidence. Without more data, you're just connecting dots that might not be connected at all. Yet your brain pushes the theory forward because it feels so satisfying to explain things. This is why conspiracy theories can take hold so easily. A few events line up in a strange way. Someone pulls up a timeline, points at coincidences, and the illusion tightens its grip. It's not that people are foolish, it's that they're wired to see meaning. They find signals in noise. The clustering illusion offers a sense of control when the world feels random or chaotic. But the comfort comes with a cost. It steers people toward conclusions not supported by the evidence. In medicine, this can be dangerous. A patient tries a new supplement. The next day, they feel better. A week later, they swear it's a miracle. Maybe it is. Maybe it's placebo. Or maybe they were already on the upswing. But now that they've linked the events, the connection feels real. They'll keep taking the supplement, recommend it to others, and possibly ignore more effective treatments. The clustering illusion can reinforce these mistaken beliefs, and because it feels logical, it's hard to shake. Even in everyday conversations, the effect shows up. A parent sees their toddler throw a tantrum every time they visit a certain store. The connection becomes a story. He always gets upset in that store. But what if it's just a few bad days? What if the store's irrelevant, and the tantrums are part of a larger developmental pattern? The parent may now avoid that store, plan errands around it, and pass that belief on to others. The illusion becomes part of the family's logic, even if it started from chance. Your brain is a pattern machine. It evolved that way for good reason. But that same power turns into a trap when it starts pulling shapes from randomness. The trick is knowing when to slow down, step back, and ask, is this really a pattern or just noise dressed up to look like one? When people start seeing ghosts in data, they often double down. They believe the pattern more strongly, the more it's challenged. That's why it helps to know the limits of intuition. Data analysis, long-term trends, large sample sizes. These are tools that cut through the fog, but they require patience. And patience is hard when your brain is offering quick answers with high confidence. If you work in law enforcement, public health, investing, marketing, or even education, this trap can shape real-world choices. You might allocate resources to the wrong places. You might chase trends that don't hold up. And worst of all, you might miss the deeper signals buried under the noise. Recognizing the clustering illusion doesn't mean you stop looking for patterns. It means you hold them up to the light. You ask harder questions. You look for evidence beyond coincidence. You accept that some things just happen together by chance. And when you do that, you see the world more clearly, not less. You don't need to ignore your instincts, but you should challenge them. That feeling of something's going on here might be right, or it might be the echo of ancient wiring, trying to keep you safe in a world that's moved on. Your mind is brilliant, but even brilliance can misfire. The clustering illusion is subtle, persistent, and deeply human. But once you learn to see it, you won't unsee it. You'll pause, take a breath, and let the randomness be random. You spend hours putting together a piece of furniture. You struggle with the instructions. A few screws go in the wrong place. You take it apart and try again. By the time it's standing, you're tired, maybe even a little frustrated. But when someone asks, "Is it any good?" you don't hesitate. You say yes. You might even say you love it. The truth is, it's wobbly. The drawers stick. The finish has scratches you didn't notice in the store. But still, you convince yourself it's worth it. Why? Because you built it. And because you worked hard, your brain tells you it must be valuable. That's effort justification. It's not just about furniture. It's a mental trap that affects your relationships, your career, your finances, and even your beliefs. When you invest time, energy, or emotion into something, your brain doesn't like the idea that it might not be worth it. So instead of questioning the value of the thing, you justify it by inflating its worth. Think about someone staying in a long-term relationship that stopped working years ago. They'll tell you they've been through so much together, they've sacrificed, they've grown, and maybe all of that is true. But they're not happy. The relationship drains them. Still, they stay. They're not staying because it's fulfilling. They're staying because leaving would mean admitting it wasn't worth the effort. And that's a hard pill to swallow. You see it in workplaces too. Someone spends years building a product that never catches on. Maybe it never even worked right, but they'll fight for it. They'll say, "We just need to market it better," or "People don't get it yet." Deep down, they might sense the flaws, but if they admit that, they have to confront the time and money they lost. That kind of realization hurts. The mind defends against it by rebranding the failure as potential. This trap doesn't need years to take root. It can happen in a single evening. You cook a complicated dinner from scratch. You follow a new recipe that calls for rare ingredients and complicated steps. The result is okay. Not bad, but not great. But you sit there eating it, nodding like it's the best meal you've ever had. You know you've had better at a restaurant, but they didn't break a sweat. You did. So your brain gives your food 5 stars. Effort justification connects closely with cognitive dissonance. That's the discomfort you feel when your actions and beliefs don't align. If you go through something hard and it turns out badly, you feel tension. Your brain doesn't like that mismatch, so it changes the belief. It turned out badly becomes "it wasn't so bad," or even "it was good, actually." This bias shows up in education. A student chooses a difficult program because it sounds prestigious. The work is grueling. They lose sleep, they miss out on social events, they get the degree, but it doesn't lead to a job they love. Still, when someone asks if they'd do it again, they say yes. Not because it brought them success or satisfaction, but because admitting regret would feel like betrayal. If they say it wasn't worth it, they'd have to face all the time they'll never get back. The mind leans toward protecting itself from that pain. In cults or extreme social groups, effort justification can take a darker turn. Members go through painful initiation rituals or make large sacrifices. They give up their privacy, their money, sometimes their identity. These groups often demand total commitment. When outsiders question them, members defend the group fiercely. They say it's changed their lives for the better. But the need to believe it was worth it may be louder than the truth. The greater the suffering, the stronger the justification. There's also a place this shows up in parenting. Some parents push themselves to exhaustion. They give up careers. They pour every ounce of attention into their kids. They believe this effort must result in exceptional children. If the child struggles, they don't rethink the approach. Instead, they double down. More tutors, more discipline, more pressure. It's hard to consider that less effort might have been just as effective or even better. The cost they've paid demands a return. Effort justification also keeps people from quitting hobbies or goals that no longer serve them. Someone who's been trying to learn the guitar for 5 years might feel stuck. They haven't improved much. They don't enjoy the practice anymore. But when asked if they'll stop, they say no. I've come this far, they say. But that distance doesn't guarantee joy or future progress. It just makes stopping feel like a waste. So they keep going, even when the love is gone. This trap can sneak into daily habits too. Think about something as simple as waiting in line. You've already stood there for 20 minutes. The service is slow. You know you could leave and find something better. But you stay because you've already waited. Walking away would make the wait feel pointless. So you throw more time at it, trying to make the lost time feel justified. But it doesn't come back, no matter how long you stay. Effort doesn't always equal value. That's a hard idea to sit with. We're raised on phrases like no pain, no gain, and hard work pays off. Sometimes it does, but not always. Sometimes the work leads nowhere. Sometimes the result isn't worth it. But we struggle to say that out loud. Part of the reason effort justification is so effective is because it gives us control. If we believe that our effort makes something good, then we stay in the driver's seat. We feel powerful. We don't want to admit that chance, timing, or external factors played a bigger role. So we make the story neat. We worked hard, so it must be good. We tie value to effort because it feels safer than facing randomness. You can see this trap in art too. An artist pours years into a project. They revise, rework, obsess. The piece finally shows. It doesn't get the response they hoped for. But instead of listening to feedback, they double down. People just don't get it, they say. Or, art takes time to be understood. And maybe that's true. Or maybe the piece just didn't connect. But after all that work, they need to believe it did. Effort justification is deeply human. It's part of how we cope with struggle. But it can cost us clarity. It can make us cling to things that don't serve us. It can lock us into sunk costs and keep us from moving on. Recognizing it doesn't make the disappointment easier, but it gives us a chance to decide differently. The next time you find yourself defending something mostly because it took a lot out of you, pause. Ask yourself if you'd value it the same way if it came easy. Would you still want it if it cost you nothing? If someone else handed it to you, would you keep it? Those questions can help cut through the bias. They won't erase the work you did, but they might help you see its true worth. You can honor the effort without pretending the outcome was worth it. Both things can be true. You tried hard and it didn't work out. That doesn't make the effort meaningless. It makes you honest. You walk out the door without checking the weather. Rain is falling halfway down the block, but you think it won't get worse. You left your umbrella behind because deep down you believe you won't need it. Not today, not you. Other people get soaked, other people lose jobs, crash cars, get sick, but not you. And if something does go wrong, you'll handle it, somehow. That's optimism bias. It's a mental shortcut, not a decision you make on purpose. It's your brain quietly telling you that your future will turn out better than everyone else's, even when there's no reason to think so. This isn't hope. Hope is conscious. Optimism bias is automatic. It lives under the surface and quietly skews how you see the world. Let's say two people are told they're at risk for heart disease. One of them changes their diet, starts walking, and schedules regular checkups. The other hears the same warning, nods, and then goes right back to fast food and 10-hour Netflix marathons. Why? They both have the same information, the same body type, the same family history. But one of them believes, without real evidence, that they'll somehow escape the outcome. That's how optimism bias works. It doesn't need a reason. It just plants the idea that bad things are for other people. You see it when young drivers speed down a wet road, thinking their reflexes will save them. You see it when people ignore hurricane warnings or push off medical screenings. The pattern repeats in different forms, but the message is always the same. It won't happen to me. It doesn't always look like recklessness. Sometimes it just looks like inaction. A person might not refuse to wear a seatbelt because they think it's stupid. They just think they won't need it. They trust their luck, their timing, their instincts. They don't say it out loud, but their choices are shaped by a quiet belief that they're the exception. This bias shows up in financial decisions, too. A person may hear that most small businesses fail in the first 5 years. They'll nod, agree, and still believe their idea is different. Their plan is better. Their odds are higher. You'll see new entrepreneurs invest everything they have, not because they did the math, but because they felt sure they'd be the outlier. Optimism bias lets them overestimate their success and underestimate risk. In relationships, it can sound like this: we won't end up like them. A couple hears that half of marriages end in divorce. They hear about stress, finances, infidelity. They see the warning signs in others, but they don't see it in themselves. They believe their love will protect them, that their connection is stronger, not based on data, based on feeling, and it feels good until it doesn't. Even when presented with hard facts, people tend to downgrade the relevance of that information. A smoker might read a study linking cigarettes to lung cancer and think, that's about other people. Even if their uncle died from it, they'll find ways to distance themselves. He smoked more than I do. He didn't exercise. I eat healthy. The brain searches for details that support the belief. I'll be fine. You might think optimism bias only affects naive or uneducated people. It doesn't. In fact, it shows up across income levels, education levels, and professions. Doctors, lawyers, pilots, they all show signs of optimism bias in different contexts. It's not about intelligence, it's about human nature. One study asked people to estimate their likelihood of experiencing various life events: getting cancer, losing their job, getting divorced. On average, people believed their personal risk was lower than that of their peers. The funny part? Everyone can't be below average. Someone has to be wrong. In this case, most people are. But the bias isn't always bad. It has a function. If you believed that every flight might crash, you wouldn't get on the plane. If you thought every date would end in heartbreak, you wouldn't meet anyone. Optimism bias can help people take risks, start businesses, pursue dreams. It cushions anxiety. It keeps you going. The problem is when it overrides caution, when it blinds you to reality. It works silently. You don't feel it pulling the strings. It just shows up in your choices. You skip the flu shot. You put off a dental appointment. You don't buy insurance. You text while driving, not because you don't care, but because you think you're safe. Look at the way people prepare for retirement. Many don't. They know it's important. They read about rising costs and longer lifespans. Still, they put off saving. Some assume they'll earn more later. Others expect to work forever. Optimism bias tells them the future will somehow work itself out. That belief can lead to years of stress when reality finally catches up. If you've ever thought, I probably don't need to worry about that, stop and ask yourself why. Is there evidence behind that belief? Or is it a quiet voice in your head saying you're different, smarter, luckier, safer? This trap isn't always loud. It's not always obvious. It doesn't yell, it whispers. It makes risk feel far away. It makes the negative outcome seem like a story about someone else. You forget that stories don't choose their characters. Car accidents don't ask if you're experienced. Cancer doesn't care if you exercise. Layoffs don't pause for your confidence. You might notice it now when you're listening to the news. A wildfire takes out homes in another state. Flooding hits a nearby town. A drunk driver crashes into a family's car, and you feel bad, but also removed. Like the screen between you and the story is a barrier of fate. But fate doesn't follow rules. It doesn't make exceptions. When you understand optimism bias, you see the little ways it shapes life. It's in the friend who never backs up their hard drive, the coworker who skips the safety training, the couple who refuses counseling. All of them believe, maybe without realizing it, that they're going to be the lucky ones. And here's the thing. Sometimes they are. Sometimes nothing happens. Sometimes people get away with it. But that doesn't mean they were right. It just means the consequences haven't landed yet. Understanding this bias isn't about becoming pessimistic. It's not about expecting the worst. It's about being clear, about knowing when your brain is editing the truth to keep you comfortable. Comfort feels good, but clarity keeps you safe. The real risk isn't the thing you're avoiding. It's believing that you're immune to it. That's what makes optimism bias dangerous. Not because it lies, but because it lies quietly in ways that feel like common sense. You can feel it when you buckle a seatbelt without thinking about it, when you lock your doors at night. Those are habits you've made, sometimes without realizing, to manage risk. But there are other areas where the bias still slips through. It's in the health check you keep postponing, the safety gear you leave behind, the retirement account you haven't opened, all the things you believe can wait, because nothing bad has happened yet. But yet is the trap. And optimism bias is the voice that keeps you from hearing it. Sometimes doing nothing feels safer than doing the wrong thing. But what if doing nothing causes just as much harm? Most people don't notice this trap. It slides in quietly, often disguised as caution or passivity. Psychologists call it the omission bias, and it's one of those hidden levers in our decision-making that skews how we judge morality, responsibility, and blame. Let's say two people are involved in a situation. The first person takes an action that harms someone. The second person has a chance to prevent harm, but chooses not to act. The outcome is the same. Someone gets hurt. Yet the first person is usually judged far more harshly. The second person often gets a pass or lighter criticism, even though their inaction caused just as much damage. That's omission bias in action. You can see it in everyday choices. Think about a doctor who decides not to treat a patient with a risky but potentially life-saving procedure. If the patient dies, people are more likely to accept it because the doctor didn't do anything, rather than risk causing harm. On the other hand, if the doctor had tried the procedure and the patient died as a result, there would be outrage, even if the intent was to help. We place a heavier moral weight on actions than on inactions, even if the consequences are the same. The logic is flawed, but it's deeply rooted in how we're wired to think. Evolutionary psychologists believe this may have started as a survival instinct. In small tribal communities, making a bad move, like picking the wrong plant to eat, had visible consequences. Doing nothing didn't draw attention, so it was safer socially and physically. That programming stuck. Today, omission bias shows up in countless areas. Consider sports. A referee might avoid calling a foul in the final seconds of a game because they don't want to be the one who decides the outcome. But by not making the call, they still decide the outcome. They just do it through omission. Fans often applaud this restraint as letting the game play out, when in truth, it's just another form of intervention. Or take parenting. One parent might avoid correcting a child's behavior in public, hoping to avoid embarrassment or escalation. But that inaction can send the message that the behavior is acceptable. The harm isn't immediate, but it builds over time. The omission becomes part of the child's learning experience, reinforcing poor boundaries or skewed expectations. There's also a legal dimension to omission bias. In many legal systems, the law treats harmful actions and harmful inactions differently. A person who actively causes harm is usually criminally liable, but someone who fails to act, unless they had a specific legal duty to do so, often escapes punishment. The moral judgment doesn't always match the legal framework. That gap between what people feel is wrong and what the law says is wrong can be a direct product of omission bias. In healthcare, this bias gets even more dangerous. Patients might choose not to vaccinate because they fear the side effects. They would rather let nature take its course than risk an action that could have consequences, even if inaction carries a greater danger. The harm from a disease might be more severe than the vaccine side effects, but because the vaccine is an action and illness feels like something that just happened, people avoid the shot. It's not about data, it's about how the choice feels, and omission feels cleaner. It's also why people often prefer default settings. Whether it's retirement savings, organ donation, or privacy controls, people stick with whatever is already set in place. even if it's not in their best interest. Changing a setting feels like an active decision. Leaving it alone feels like staying neutral. But that false neutrality can cost money, health, or even lives. In this context, omission bias interacts with what's called status quo bias, and the two can reinforce each other. Relationships aren't immune either. You might not speak up about a hurtful comment. You might not tell your partner you're unhappy. You might not ask for what you need. Each omission adds weight to the silence. Over time, that weight can be heavier than any one action. The harm is slow and quiet, but it builds. Still, when things fall apart, people often say, "At least I didn't do anything to hurt them." That may be true, but they also didn't do anything to help. Let's look at a business example. A manager notices a team member struggling, but doesn't intervene. They assume the person will figure it out. The deadline passes. The project flops. The manager might think, "Well, I didn't sabotage them." But they also didn't support them. The team member may bear the brunt of the blame, even though timely guidance could have changed the outcome. This bias also creates loopholes in moral self-image. People want to see themselves as good. Taking a harmful action feels like a stain on that image. But not doing something, especially if it's out of sight, doesn't feel like a moral failure. It feels like staying neutral. So people use omission bias to justify self-protective behaviors. I didn't speak up because it wasn't my business. I didn't help because I didn't want to get involved. These stories maintain a clean conscience without having to confront the actual impact of inaction. Even on a societal level, omission bias shapes public behavior. Leaders may avoid making tough calls, waiting for clearer data, or public support. But in waiting, they often let preventable damage occur. Think about environmental policy. A government might delay regulating pollution because the regulations would upset industries. That delay feels like neutrality, but ecosystems degrade, health problems increase, and long-term costs rise. The omission caused real harm, but it often escaped scrutiny because there was no direct action to point to. There's a subtle emotional component too. Guilt attaches more easily to actions. Regret clings to what we did, not always what we failed to do. But the pain of omission can last longer. People don't always feel it right away. It comes later, when the window to act has closed. That's part of what makes omission bias so deceptive. It hides its impact behind the comfort of inaction. To challenge this bias, you need to look past the surface of decision-making. Ask, what am I avoiding doing? Why does it feel easier to do nothing? What are the consequences of not acting? Flip the lens. Treat inaction as a decision, not a default. Recognize that the moral weight of doing nothing can be just as heavy as doing something wrong. It's not about becoming impulsive or reactive. It's about understanding that in many situations, silence is a statement. Stillness is a stance. The absence of action is a choice, and often it's a choice that carries real consequences for yourself and the people around you. You might think you like a song because it's good, but the truth is, you might like it simply because you've heard it enough times. It starts small. You hear a tune in the background while shopping. Later that week, it plays during a commercial. By the time it hits your playlist, it feels familiar, and for some reason, you like it. This is the mere exposure effect. It's a psychological pattern where repeated exposure to something makes you like it more, even if it didn't interest you at first. This doesn't just happen with music. It happens with faces, ideas, places, logos, even fonts. The brain tends to choose what's familiar, not necessarily what's best. It treats familiarity as a sign of safety or reliability. That's why a brand logo you've seen 100 times feels more trustworthy than a new one, even if you know nothing about either company. The root of this lies in how the brain evolved. In the past, survival depended on reacting to threats. Unfamiliar things could mean danger. New places, unknown faces, strange foods, all of these triggered alertness. On the other hand, something you'd encountered many times without harm, that was probably safe. So your brain learned to associate familiarity with comfort. That same logic now applies to a poster on a wall, a repeated ad on social media, or a character in a TV show. Let's say someone meets a new coworker. The first impression might be neutral. Nothing stands out. But over weeks of seeing them around the office, the presence becomes part of the daily landscape. Eventually, they start to feel more likable. Nothing big changes, no bonding moment, just repeated exposure. Familiarity grows, so does affection. It's not magic, it's how the brain works. The effect also shows up in political campaigns. Candidates often repeat slogans, taglines, or certain gestures. Their names appear everywhere, on lawn signs, billboards, online ads. Even if someone doesn't like politics, constant exposure to a candidate's name can build a sense of recognition. That recognition can subtly shift into preference. It's not that the person's policies changed, it's that the brain prefers the name it's seen more. In relationships, the mere exposure effect can explain how acquaintances become close friends or even romantic partners. Someone you see regularly, at school, at work, at a community event, starts to feel more comfortable, even if the interactions are brief. Without realizing it, you begin to enjoy their presence. You might not be able to point to a specific reason why. You just feel like you click. That feeling may come, in part, from simple exposure over time. This effect has been tested many times. In one experiment, researchers showed participants a series of faces. Some faces appeared only once, others appeared several times. Later, when asked which faces they liked more, participants consistently chose the ones they had seen more often. The faces hadn't smiled, they hadn't spoken, they hadn't done anything memorable, but the brain had tagged them as familiar, and that was enough. Now think about how this plays out online. You scroll through your feed and see a meme once. It's just there. A few days later, it shows up again. You might smile. The fifth time, you might share it. Familiarity builds comfort, and comfort builds preference. This is part of why certain content goes viral. Repetition drives attention, and attention creates an impression of value. This effect also plays into consumer behavior. A brand that advertises often becomes recognizable. When faced with a decision, buy toothpaste A or toothpaste B, you might lean toward the one you've seen before. Not because it's better, not because you've tried it, just because your brain recognizes it. Familiarity gives it an edge. Even product packaging matters. If you're shopping and you see a box with a design you've seen several times before, even without reading the label, you're more likely to feel okay picking it up. That's not rational thinking. That's the mere exposure effect in real time. There's also a downside. Familiar doesn't mean good. It just feels safe. This can make people stay in unhealthy patterns, relationships, or routines simply because they're used to them. A job that drains you, a partner who dismisses you, a habit that holds you back. If they're part of your daily rhythm, your brain might resist change, even if the alternative is better. The brain isn't trying to sabotage, it's trying to protect. But comfort isn't always the same as happiness. What feels safe isn't always what helps you grow. Another issue is that repetition can be used to manipulate. Advertisers, political strategists, and influencers know how to use this effect. They understand that repetition plants seeds. Repetition doesn't need consent. It doesn't need engagement. It just needs exposure. And over time, it can shape how someone feels about a product, a person, or even an idea. That's why misinformation spreads so effectively. When a false statement gets repeated enough, people start to believe it, even if they initially knew it wasn't true. It begins to feel right. The brain confuses familiarity with accuracy. That's dangerous in the wrong hands. But not all uses are negative. Educators use repetition for learning. Coaches use it in training. Parents use it to build structure. The effect itself isn't good or bad. It's just a pattern the brain follows. Like gravity, it can help you stand or cause you to fall, depending on how you interact with it. Knowing about the mere exposure effect gives you a small shield. It doesn't stop the effect from happening, but it lets you notice it. You might catch yourself liking something and ask, do I actually enjoy this, or have I just seen it too much? That small pause adds a layer of awareness. It might also explain why you find comfort in rewatching shows, rereading books, or revisiting places. There's safety in the known. There's quiet joy in the familiar. It's not laziness. It's not nostalgia. It's a psychological reflex built deep into your wiring. You might walk into a coffee shop and find yourself drawn to the same seat. Not because it's the best one, but because you've sat there before. You might listen to a playlist and realize the songs are old, but they feel right. They sound like home. Exposure can do that. It makes things feel like part of your world. This isn't a trick. It's not a hack. It's just how your mind leans into the known. It saves energy, it reduces anxiety, it builds routines, and over time, it draws soft lines between what feels distant and what feels close. So the next time something catches your eye or warms your heart, don't rush to judge. Step back. Ask if it's truly special or just familiar. Either answer is fine, but the question makes all the difference. You sit down to knock out a task that should only take a couple of hours. Maybe it's writing a report, cleaning the garage, or fixing a few things on your website. You estimate a clear block of time in your head. 2 hours, maybe 3 max. But then the afternoon disappears. You look up and it's dark outside. You're only halfway done. You wonder where the time went. This isn't a time management issue. It's not laziness or distraction either. It's something called the planning fallacy. The planning fallacy is a psychological trap where we underestimate how long a task will take, even when we've done something similar before. What's strange is that this bias shows up even when we know better. You can recall previous projects taking longer than expected, yet you'll still believe this time will be different. That sense of optimism isn't a choice. It's baked into the way we think. This effect was first named by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in the 1970s. They noticed that people consistently made inaccurate predictions about time, cost, and workload. The key insight was that we tend to focus only on the specific details of the current task and ignore historical evidence. For example, someone writing a thesis might know that most students take a year to finish, but still believe they'll be done in 6 months because their plan feels solid. They tell themselves they're more motivated, more focused, more organized. They look at the best-case scenario and treat it like the most likely outcome. Let's look at a regular scenario. Say you need to paint your living room. You walk through the steps in your head. You'll clear the furniture, tape the trim, lay down the drop cloths, and then paint 2 coats. Should take 4 hours tops, right? That's how it sounds in your mind. But here's what usually happens. You start late because you had to run to the store for supplies. The wall needs a second layer of primer. The baseboards are dustier than you thought, so now you're cleaning. You hit a few corners that require small brushes, slowing things down. Somewhere along the way, you take a phone call. Suddenly it's dinner time, and you haven't finished the first coat. These aren't freak accidents. They're the rule, not the exception. We forget to build in the hidden tasks. We overlook the possibility of delays. We count our ideal pace, not our real one. That's how the planning fallacy works. It isn't about misjudging once. It's a pattern. People consistently ignore how long things actually take in the real world because they focus too much on what they think should happen. Even large organizations fall into this trap. Infrastructure projects are notorious for running over budget and behind schedule. Think of public transportation systems, bridges, stadiums. Many of them launch with firm timelines and fixed budgets. But when it's time to review, the costs have doubled and the deadlines have been pushed back by years. You might assume this happens because of corruption or bad management, and sometimes that's true. But often, it's just the planning fallacy on a larger scale. Decision makers rely too heavily on the initial vision and don't account for delays, negotiations, weather, or the long list of other possible slowdowns. This bias even sneaks into your daily life. You set aside an hour to send emails, thinking that's plenty. But then you reread a few messages before replying. You stop to check a fact. You edit for tone. You lose track of the time. That quick hour becomes your whole morning. You look back and wonder how it got away from you again. But the answer is always the same. You didn't think through the real-world friction. Even your own history won't always protect you. Let's say you once organized a birthday party. It took 2 full days to plan, shop, decorate, and coordinate. The next time around, you think, I'll be quicker this time. I know the process now. You tell yourself it'll only take 1 afternoon, but you still forget how long it takes to clean the house, pick up balloons, or deal with last-minute RSVPs. The result? You're stressed and rushing through the same mistakes. There's another twist here. When you're working with others, the planning fallacy gets worse. People assume their teammates will deliver on time, even when past experience says otherwise. You count on people being available, responsive, and quick. But people have competing priorities. They get sick. They misread instructions. They underestimate their own timelines. So your perfect plan falls apart, not because you were careless, but because you didn't account for real-world variation. This trap also messes with your stress levels. You believe a task will be over quickly, so you put it off. I'll just knock it out Friday morning. Then Friday comes, and it balloons into something massive. You're under pressure. You cancel other plans, you stay up late. And still, you blame yourself for bad time management, when in reality, you fell into a predictable mental trap. The problem wasn't your discipline, it was your expectation. You can't totally avoid the planning fallacy, but you can account for it. One way is to use what's called reference class forecasting. That's a fancy term for a simple strategy. Instead of thinking about how long this specific task should take, ask how long similar tasks have taken in the past. If it usually takes you 2 weeks to write a proposal, don't assume this one will take 3 days just because it feels more straightforward. Use the average, not the dream scenario. Another method is to schedule buffer time as a rule. Don't wait for problems to show up. Build in space. If you think a meeting will take an hour, block off 90 minutes. If you plan to write something in a day, give yourself 2. That extra space is your insurance against reality, traffic, interruptions, tech issues, and fatigue. You can also break tasks into smaller parts and estimate each one. Instead of thinking, I'll clean the garage this weekend, split it into real steps. Clear out old boxes, sweep the floor, donate items, reorganize tools. Estimate each one separately. You'll probably still get it wrong, but you'll get closer. It helps to say things out loud too. There's something about putting your prediction into words that forces more honesty. When you catch yourself saying, I'll knock this out in an hour, pause. Ask yourself, what's included in that hour? Just the writing, or also the editing, the proofreading, the upload process? These steps blur together in your mind, but they take up real time. Naming them makes the invisible visible. Another trick is to talk to someone who's done it before. If you're planning something new, a move, a launch, a trip, ask someone who's been through it. Ask them what surprised them. Ask what they underestimated. Use their hindsight as your foresight. The planning fallacy isn't a flaw in your character. It's not laziness, pride, or disorganization. It's a bug in the way the human brain simulates the future. Your mind fast-forwards through time without friction, assuming an ideal path. The real world doesn't work that way. It's full of slowdowns and curveballs. That's not pessimism, it's just how life moves. The trick is to respect that and leave room for it, rather than being blindsided every time. No matter how many times you fall for it, you're not broken. You're human. You build timelines the same way everyone does, based on hope, not history. The key is to catch yourself in the act. Notice when your prediction feels tight or optimistic. That's the signal to double it, or at least question it. Because odds are it's going to take longer than you think. It always does. You probably think you're one of a kind. Not in a dramatic, ego-driven way, but in a quiet, almost subconscious sense. You believe your tastes are rare, your views are well considered, and your actions are shaped by deep personal reasons that set you apart from the crowd. This belief is comforting. It helps explain why you sometimes feel disconnected from others, why you assume people wouldn't fully understand your reasoning, or why you silently pride yourself on not being like most people. But here's the knot. You're likely not as unique as you think you are. This is where the false uniqueness effect comes in. It's a subtle trap that tricks your brain into believing that your positive qualities, your intelligence, your values, your kindness, your creativity, are less common in the general population than they actually are. And this isn't just ego, it's a mental shortcut your brain takes without asking your permission. Let's say you volunteer at a local shelter on weekends. You might feel like you're part of a rare group of people who give up their free time for something meaningful. You might think most people wouldn't bother, and that feeling might deepen your sense of self-worth. But statistically, a surprising number of people donate time to causes regularly, quietly, without recognition. If you knew that, would it take anything away from your contribution? Maybe not. But the feeling of standing out might fade. The false uniqueness effect doesn't only show up in noble scenarios. It can appear in small, everyday ways. Think about how you respond to surveys or quizzes online. If a poll asks whether you recycle, vote, support mental health, or believe in equality, you probably say yes. You may also think most people don't. You see yourself as more informed, more caring, more aware. But studies often show that the majority of people claim to hold these same values. So what feels like a personal marker of identity might be more common than you assumed. This doesn't make those values less important. It just means they're not as rare as they seem. And if you think about it, that should be encouraging. Shared values build strong social fabric. But the trap is when this belief in uniqueness turns into quiet arrogance or emotional distance. You may think others can't relate to your struggles because yours are more complex. Or you might believe your motives are purer, your taste is sharper, your thinking is deeper. When in truth, you're not an outlier, you're inside the curve. This also shows up in how people judge their talents. Ask someone whether they're a good driver. Most people will say yes, but not just yes, they'll say they're better than average. It's mathematically impossible for everyone to be above average, but they still believe it. A similar thing happens in relationships. People believe they're more supportive, more loyal, or more emotionally intelligent than others. In group settings, like workplaces or friend circles, people assume they contribute more than others realize. They also believe their intentions are more sincere. When others don't notice, it feels like being underappreciated. But the truth is, everyone else thinks they're quietly carrying more weight too. This doesn't mean people are lying. It just means they're experiencing reality through the lens of the false uniqueness effect. And this lens isn't always conscious. Most of the time, you won't notice it at all. It hums in the background like a soft engine, shaping how you interpret what you see and hear. It whispers that you're a little more insightful than others give you credit for. That your quiet choices matter more than people realize. That if only they knew what was going on inside your head, they'd understand how different you are. But here's where it gets tricky. This belief can isolate you. It can make you dismiss the input of others. You might think they're not capable of understanding your complexity. You might avoid conversations because you assume they won't meet you where you are. This trap isn't loud. It doesn't show itself in arguments or debates. It shows up in silence, in avoidance, in a soft kind of loneliness that feels justified. On the flip side, it can also hurt your ability to build empathy. When you believe your struggles or insights are unusual, it's easy to overlook the fact that others have gone through the same things. Maybe they didn't talk about it. Maybe they didn't show it the same way. But the assumption that your inner world is a private, one-of-a-kind blueprint can keep you from seeing how many people walk around with nearly identical patterns. Let's take a more personal example. Say you grew up in a chaotic home. You developed a way of reading people, picking up on tones of voice or subtle changes in expression. You got good at predicting moods. Now, as an adult, you feel like this ability is something very few others have. You call it intuition, and it is real. But you might be surprised to learn how many others learned the same skill for the same reason. You're not alone in how you adapted. You're not the only one who notices the small stuff. But the false uniqueness effect might keep you believing that your emotional intelligence is rare, that others couldn't possibly see what you see. This illusion affects decision-making too. People who believe they're less susceptible to advertising, peer pressure, or emotional bias are often the ones most vulnerable to it. Because they don't see themselves as typical, they don't guard against typical traps. That's how this bias can be self-reinforcing. The more you believe you're different, the less likely you are to consider that you're making common mistakes. You stop checking yourself. And once that happens, the bias becomes harder to break. The false uniqueness effect also shows up in conflict. When two people disagree, both often believe they're the one being more reasonable, more open, more willing to listen. They both think the other person is being rigid or emotional, and they both think they're seeing the big picture while the other is stuck in a narrow frame. This belief fuels the divide. It makes compromise feel like giving in to someone who just doesn't get it. But often they do get it. They're just seeing it from a slightly different angle, and they think you don't get them either. Even in creativity, this shows up. You write something, paint something, record something, and it feels personal. You think no one's done it quite like this. You post it, and someone comments, "This reminds me of," and it stings. Because in your head, this was your own voice. But originality isn't about being unlike anything else. It's about saying something true in a way that only you can. Still, the false uniqueness effect can make any comparison feel like a threat, like someone's chipping away at the edge you thought you had. So, what do you do with all this? You notice it. That's the whole game. You don't need to stop valuing your perspective. You don't need to downplay your skills. But you might need to ask, am I really that different? Or do I just want to be? Have I decided other people don't get it? Or have I just stopped checking to see if they might? The real power in noticing this trap isn't about humility. It's about connection. When you realize you're not so different, you open the door to understanding. You give other people more credit. You listen longer. You ask better questions. And maybe most importantly, you stop carrying the silent burden of being the only one who sees the world the way you do. Because odds are, you're not. You walk past the unopened letter on your kitchen counter every day. You know it's from the clinic. You know it probably holds lab results or a follow-up recommendation. But instead of opening it, you shift your eyes, pretend you didn't see it, and convince yourself there's no rush. That's not laziness or forgetfulness. That's something else. It's a trap built into how the human mind protects itself: information avoidance. Information avoidance happens when people deliberately steer clear of information that could cause discomfort, challenge beliefs, or force difficult decisions. It's the psychological version of sticking your fingers in your ears and saying, "I can't hear you." The motive isn't ignorance, it's emotional safety. When facing potentially threatening news, financial trouble, health issues, failing relationships, or even poor performance reviews, many people instinctively block out the signals. It's not that they don't know the information exists, it's that they don't want to feel what that information might mean. Let's take a common example. Someone notices a lump or a new symptom that doesn't seem right. They think, "I should get that checked." Days pass, then weeks. They tell themselves they're too busy, but deep down, they fear the diagnosis. The uncertainty feels less painful than the possible truth. So they delay the call, they avoid the appointment, they tune out the reminders. This is not irrationality, it's a defense. Their brain is trying to preserve the illusion of stability for just a little longer. This behavior isn't limited to health. Think about your finances. A person knows they've been spending more than they should. They ignore the bank statements piling up. They avoid opening budgeting apps. They don't log in to check the credit card balance. Why? Because seeing the numbers in black and white makes it real. It creates urgency, and urgency brings discomfort. That discomfort comes with a demand: change something, do something, face something. Many people aren't ready for that, so instead they stay in the dark. The light is just too harsh. In romantic relationships, the same avoidance shows up in different forms. Someone suspects their partner has lost interest. They notice subtle changes, less affection, shorter replies, canceled plans, but they avoid initiating the conversation. They tell themselves it's just a rough patch. They avoid reading between the lines. They postpone the talk. Why? Because hearing the truth may mean the end of the relationship. So instead, they float in a bubble of ambiguity. It feels safer, until it doesn't. This isn't just anecdotal. Researchers have found that people will often avoid medical screenings even when the testing is free and could save their lives. In a study, people were given the chance to learn their genetic risk for certain diseases. Many declined. Not because they didn't believe in science, not because they didn't trust the test. They simply didn't want to know. They feared what knowing might require: treatment, lifestyle changes, insurance implications, or even just anxiety. And so they avoided it. The core problem with information avoidance is that it offers relief in the short term, but creates bigger problems later. When you delay facing the truth, the situation doesn't freeze. It continues to evolve. Sometimes it worsens. In fact, the longer the delay, the harder the recovery. A person who avoids financial statements for 6 months might dig themselves into debt they can't manage. A person who skips medical checkups might miss the window for early treatment. A person who avoids feedback at work might lose opportunities for growth or promotion. Yet, we still do it. Not because we don't care, but because caring comes with emotional weight. Sometimes knowing something forces a change in identity. If a person finds out they have a chronic condition, they stop being just themselves and become a patient. That's a psychological shift that carries loss, grief, and fear. So they postpone it. They choose the peace of ignorance over the burden of action. This trap is so effective because it operates quietly. It doesn't feel like a decision. It often feels like procrastination, or being too busy, or just not ready. But under the surface, there's a calculation happening. The brain evaluates emotional cost versus current stability. If the cost feels too high, avoidance wins. It's protective in the short term, but corrosive in the long run. Social media and technology can make this even worse. The way we consume information now makes it easy to filter out discomfort. Algorithms show us what we like. We can unfollow people who challenge us. We can mute bad news. We can scroll past statistics or real stories of suffering and injustice. We can build an information bubble made of comfort and ease. That's another form of information avoidance. It's not just about avoiding personal risk, but avoiding emotional discomfort altogether. Even in group settings, this trap shows up. A team might suspect that a project is headed toward failure, but no one wants to speak up. A family might know someone is struggling with addiction, but they all agree not to talk about it. An organization may sense cultural problems, but everyone looks the other way. Silence becomes a coping mechanism. Avoiding the information allows everyone to preserve the illusion of harmony, even as reality fractures beneath it. There's also the way people use humor or distraction to sidestep serious issues. Someone brings up something uncomfortable, and the conversation is derailed with a joke or a subject change. It's subtle, but powerful. That's information avoidance too, redirecting the mind away from material that might force reflection or confrontation. It works in families, friend groups, classrooms, and boardrooms. Even those who value truth and rationality fall into this trap. In fact, the more emotionally invested someone is in a belief or lifestyle, the more likely they are to avoid conflicting information. A person who prides themselves on health might avoid reading articles that question their favorite diet. A parent may avoid research that challenges their approach to discipline. A professional might ignore new trends that make their skill set less relevant. Because information doesn't just inform, it confronts. It calls for reevaluation. Sometimes, information avoidance isn't even conscious. The brain simply fails to register the details that would create tension. A person might skim past the most important line in an email. They might forget about an upcoming deadline until it's too late. They might miss key signs in a conversation because acknowledging them would raise stakes. The brain edits reality, not to deceive, but to protect. And yet, this protection has a cost. You trade short-term comfort for long-term resilience. The danger isn't just missing information, it's falling out of sync with reality. Living in that gap makes it harder to act, harder to adapt, and harder to grow. The longer you stay in the bubble, the more fragile the world outside it becomes. There's nothing weak or foolish about information avoidance. It's human. It's rooted in self-preservation, but it's also limiting. And once you know it's there, you can start to watch for it. The unopened envelope, the silent treatment, the vague someday promises, the things you keep saying you'll get to, next week, next month, when life slows down. Pay attention to what you keep not knowing. That's where the trap lives. You say yes to dinner with a friend even though you're exhausted. You agree to join a project at work even when your plate is already full. You scroll for 10 more minutes before bed. You let your inbox pile up because it can wait. Each of these decisions feels small, too small to really matter. They slip past your radar without setting off alarms. No single choice seems like a turning point. But over time, they stack, and not in your favor. This is the tyranny of small decisions. It's what happens when little choices, seemingly harmless or even smart in isolation, slowly add up to big consequences you never intended. It's missing the forest for the trees, one minor detour at a time. You don't plan to stay in a job you hate for 10 years, but you agree to stay a little longer to help with the transition. Then you say yes to one more task. Then a raise comes along and it feels like a reason to stick it out. Before long, you're building a life around a set of compromises that were never meant to be permanent. The big outcome isn't a single decision. It's the result of hundreds of micro decisions, none of which felt decisive at the time. It shows up in relationships too. You overlook one dismissive comment. You tell yourself they're just tired. You avoid a difficult conversation because it's not the right time. You agree to things that make you uncomfortable to keep the peace. None of it feels like a red flag on its own, but the pattern is there, forming quietly. The weight builds slowly until suddenly it's too heavy to carry without cracking. Marketers and system designers understand this trap deeply. Subscription services bank on the idea that you won't cancel a free trial. Not because you've decided it's worth the money, but because opting out feels like a hassle. One day becomes a week, becomes a year. You've paid hundreds for something you don't use, all because the moment to act never felt urgent. Airlines and tech companies use the same psychology. Every small upgrade, every extra click, every auto renewal nudges you a little further into their ecosystem. By the time you notice, it feels too complex to undo. The problem with small decisions isn't just that they pile up, it's that they distract you from thinking in systems. You treat each moment like it's disconnected from the last. But habits don't form in isolation. They build momentum. One skipped workout becomes two. One missed call becomes avoidance. One compromise becomes your new normal. You don't fall into a rut all at once. You coast into it without steering. In behavioral economics, this is a known phenomenon. Decision fatigue and inertia play a role. The more small decisions you make, the more your brain starts to conserve energy by relying on default behaviors. That's when the real trap sets in. You're no longer choosing with intention. You're reacting to the easiest path forward, the one with the least friction. And unfortunately, the path of least resistance rarely leads to the life you want. People often look for the big decision that changed everything. The job they took, the city they moved to, the relationship they ended or began. But those stories are rarely as clean as they seem. Big moments are almost always preceded by a long series of small ones. You drift into debt, you drift into burnout, you drift into disconnection. The final moment looks dramatic, but the path there was paved quietly. Sometimes it shows up in health. You snack because you're bored. You stay up late because you want one more episode. You skip a checkup. You ignore small signs because they're not serious. Yet, years later, you're dealing with chronic fatigue or avoidable illness. Not because you didn't care, but because each small decision made sense in the moment. You just didn't see the pattern until it was too late to stop it early. The tyranny isn't that the decisions are bad, it's that they're invisible. They don't demand your attention. They don't feel urgent. And because they don't scream for you to stop, you don't. There's no dramatic music, no fork in the road, just a slow, steady pull away from where you thought you were going. It's uncomfortable to look at. It means admitting that you're not always steering, that you're letting autopilot handle more than you thought. But awareness helps. Once you start seeing patterns, you can interrupt them. You can ask whether this choice aligns with the direction you want to go, not just whether it's convenient right now. You can start tracking the defaults you've stopped questioning. How many times do you say yes when you mean maybe? How often do you postpone something you know will snowball? Where are you spending energy that doesn't bring return? These questions don't require radical answers. They just ask for clarity. You don't need to overhaul your life. You need to notice the small things that are shaping it without permission. The tiny leaks in the ship, the unexamined routines. There's a subtle power in small decisions. They build trust in yourself or they erode it. They make your future easier or harder. They make you the kind of person who honors your time or gives it away freely, who faces discomfort for long-term peace or avoids it and accumulates chaos. This trap can be disarmed, but it requires slowing down, not in a dramatic way, but in a daily way. Checking in with the version of yourself a year from now. Asking, will they thank me for this? Not every small decision has to be optimized, but more of them should be examined, because life doesn't change in one sweeping gesture. It changes in 1,000 tiny steps. And if you're not paying attention, you might walk into a life you never meant to build. You think you're being rational when you compare two things side by side. You believe the more you weigh the pros and cons, the more likely you are to make the right choice. But your brain plays a quiet trick on you every time. It starts magnifying tiny differences, ones that barely matter in real life. And suddenly those small things start to feel big. Let's say you're shopping for a pair of headphones. You narrow it down to two models. One has 24 hours of battery life. The other has 26. You stare at the specs for minutes, thinking about those extra 2 hours. You convince yourself it's worth the extra cost. But ask yourself this: when was the last time you wore headphones for 24 hours straight? Probably never. You're caught in a trap where the difference is only visible in that moment of comparison, not in actual use. That's distinction bias. This bias kicks in when you're in a side-by-side decision mode. You notice small differences more than you normally would. And because you notice them, you assign more value to them than they actually deserve. It doesn't only apply to shopping. It shows up when you're reviewing resumes, picking between job offers, deciding which apartment to rent, or even choosing which friend's party to attend. You're seeing things through a narrow comparative lens instead of through the lens of your everyday experience. Let's try another example. You're choosing between two apartments. One has 850 square feet, the other has 900. When those numbers are listed side by side, 900 feels significantly bigger. You picture extra space, more comfort, maybe even a better lifestyle. But stand in both rooms without those numbers floating in your head, and you probably wouldn't notice the difference. Yet your brain keeps nudging you toward the one with 900. Why? Because the difference feels bigger when you compare directly, even if it doesn't actually matter once you move in. Distinction bias distorts your judgment by shifting your focus to differences that become irrelevant outside the decision frame. It draws your attention to surface-level features and distracts you from what actually affects your day-to-day experience. You make a choice that's optimized for comparison, not for reality. You might see this when comparing job offers too. One offers a salary of $72,000, the other $74,000. On paper, that $2,000 jump feels meaningful. You start calculating what you can do with that extra money. But in practical terms, that's less than $40 a week after taxes. Will it improve your life? Maybe, maybe not. But if the $72,000 job has a shorter commute, better culture, and less stress, it's likely the better choice. Still, you lean toward the $74,000 job because you're comparing numbers in isolation. It's the comparison format that causes this distortion. Distinction bias thrives in side-by-side layouts. You almost never feel it when you consider options separately. If you looked at one job offer, waited a day, and then saw the second, you'd focus more on how each fits your needs rather than how they match up to each other. That shift in format, evaluating options on their own rather than side by side, can give you a clearer picture. Restaurants use this trick on menus. You're more likely to order a dish that costs $18 when it's listed next to one that costs $24. You focus on the price difference rather than asking if the $18 meal is actually what you want. The presence of a more expensive item makes the $18 seem like a good deal. But if you saw that same $18 meal listed alone, would you still choose it? Or would you take a step back and think about what you're in the mood for? Advertisers and marketers know how to use distinction bias against you. That's why websites show product comparison tables. It's why subscription services have basic, pro, and premium plans stacked side by side. You start focusing on features like advanced analytics or priority support without asking whether those features even matter for your use case. It feels like you're making a smarter choice because you're comparing. But really, you're being nudged. It doesn't end with purchases or jobs. It can creep into how you evaluate people. You're on a hiring panel, and two candidates sit back to back in your memory. One has 4 years of experience, the other has 5. One used Photoshop for 3 projects, the other for 5. These things stand out when you're forced to decide between them. You might find yourself leaning toward the one with the slightly longer resume. But think about it. Are those extra projects really what makes someone better at a job? Or is it something deeper, like creativity, attitude, or ability to learn? Those things don't always show up in a spreadsheet. In relationships, this bias can lead to poor judgment too. You might start comparing your partner to someone else, not on emotional connection or shared values, but on surface things: how they dress, how tall they are, how quickly they text back. Suddenly, things that never bothered you become important differences. But would those same things matter to you if you weren't making a comparison? Even in self-evaluation, distinction bias plays a quiet role. You scroll through social media, comparing your life to others. You look at someone else's vacation photos and compare them to your routine weekend. You see a friend's work milestone and hold it against your own progress. You start analyzing differences that wouldn't even register if you were focused on your own goals and values instead of someone else's highlight reel. The hard part is that distinction bias doesn't feel like a bias. It feels like logic. It feels like careful analysis. You think you're being thorough. You think you're making a smarter decision. But you're actually overemphasizing things that barely matter in the long run. That small difference in megapixels between two phone cameras, you won't notice. That slightly higher thread count in the sheets, you won't feel it. But in the moment of comparison, your brain says, this matters. The way out is awareness. Recognize when you're in side-by-side mode. Step back and ask how much the difference really affects your experience. Try evaluating options one at a time based on your real needs, not based on what looks better next to something else. Ask what you'd choose if you only saw this one and never knew the other existed. We like to think that more information leads to better choices, but more comparison isn't always helpful. Sometimes it just leads you to overthink small stuff and ignore what really matters. That's the quiet power of distinction bias. It pulls your attention toward what's visible, not what's valuable. You're being watched, and suddenly everything changes. You sit straighter, you speak more carefully, you become a slightly edited version of yourself. This isn't about paranoia or stage fright. It's a well-documented psychological trap known as the Reactivity Effect. At its core, it means that the act of observing someone can change how they behave. This happens more often than we think. In school, students might act more focused when a teacher walks by. In a meeting, someone might speak up with an idea just because the manager is in the room. In a study on productivity, workers at a factory improved their performance simply because they knew researchers were measuring their output. When the observation ended, so did the spike in performance. That experiment became one of the most cited early examples of this trap. It's often called the Hawthorne Effect, named after the Western Electric Factory in Hawthorne, Illinois, where it took place. Let's break it down. You're doing your work the way you normally do. Typing, checking your phone now and then, maybe taking a break to scroll. But then someone walks in and stands behind you. You notice their presence. Without thinking about it, you straighten up. You click out of the browser tab. You start doing the thing that looks the most like work. You didn't plan this reaction. You didn't even decide it. It just happened. This isn't just social politeness or fear of judgment. It's how the human brain responds to being observed. There's a reason for it. We're social animals. For thousands of years, survival meant staying in good standing with the group. Getting kicked out of the tribe could mean starvation or death. So we developed strong internal sensors that activate when someone's attention is on us. Today, that ancient wiring still kicks in, whether it's a friend, a stranger, or a security camera. Even the idea of being watched can shift how we act. It's not just physical behavior. Our thoughts can change too. People in studies tend to give more socially acceptable answers when they believe their responses are being reviewed by a person rather than a machine. Even when filling out surveys alone, if they think someone will read their answers, they often choose what they think looks better. The internal monologue starts. What will they think? Will this make me seem smart, kind, normal? Now, consider this in everyday life. A new employee might work overtime during their first week just to be noticed. Not because they enjoy it, but because they know someone's watching. Or think about social media. People shape their posts to show a certain version of themselves because there's an audience, real or imagined. This is still reactivity. It's just digital. The same thing happens in research settings, which is where this trap becomes especially tricky. If scientists want to study honest behavior, but participants know they're being monitored, they often adjust what they do. Someone who might cheat on a test normally could refrain simply because a researcher is nearby. A person might exaggerate their generosity when they know they're being filmed giving to charity. This corrupts the data. It paints a picture of how people want to be seen, not who they are when nobody's looking. But this trap isn't always harmful. Sometimes, reactivity leads to positive outcomes. In hospitals, for example, knowing that hand-washing compliance is being monitored has led to better hygiene. In schools, students often perform better under direct observation. If you want to push yourself at the gym, training with a friend might help, simply because you know they're watching. The pressure creates a short burst of improvement. It's not sustainable, but it works in the moment. The downside is that reactivity can distort both performance and perception. A manager might assume an employee is always engaged because they act that way during meetings, but privately, they could be checked out. A researcher might publish findings that show ideal behavior when, in fact, those behaviors disappear once the experiment ends. It raises a question: how do you study something without interfering with it? It also complicates trust. If you change your behavior just because someone is around, are you being fake? Most people would say no. It's more of a reflex than a deception. But it does create a kind of duality, the version of you that acts freely when alone and the version that adapts under a gaze. Some people experience this more strongly than others. Those with social anxiety, for example, often live in a heightened state of perceived observation. They feel watched, even when they aren't. As a result, they're always editing, correcting, managing how they come across. In workplaces, this leads to performative productivity, staying late just to be seen at your desk, answering emails immediately to look engaged, even if it interrupts focus. Leaders might not see the real problem until it's too late. Metrics look fine on the surface, but morale is quietly slipping. People don't feel free to be honest because they're stuck in performative mode. Even children respond to this. In classrooms where teachers use cameras or walk around constantly, students often behave better, but they also report feeling more stressed. They're not sure if they're being judged or supported. They feel like they're on display. Over time, this can cause burnout, especially for kids who already struggle with attention or self-regulation. It's not just about authority either. Peer observation can have the same effect. Being around high-achieving classmates might make someone study harder, but it might also make them feel inadequate, like they have to hide any struggles or gaps in understanding. The line between motivation and pressure is thin. So what do we do with this? Understanding the reactivity trap means recognizing when your behavior is a response to attention rather than a reflection of intention. It helps to ask yourself, would I still be doing this if no one was watching? Sometimes the answer will be yes, and that's fine. Other times, it'll make you pause. You might realize you're acting out of pressure, not purpose. This awareness also matters for anyone trying to understand people. Teachers, managers, researchers, even friends. If you want to see someone's true behavior, you have to create environments where they feel unobserved or safe enough to let the mask drop. That doesn't mean turning your back or leaving them alone. It means building trust. When people trust that they won't be judged, they act more authentically, even when they're being watched. In therapy, for example, it often takes several sessions before a client stops trying to perform and starts speaking openly. They begin by saying what they think they should say. Eventually, they start saying what they need to say. That shift is where real insight lives, and it only happens when the sense of being judged fades, even if the therapist is still sitting right there. The reactivity trap reminds us that observation is never neutral. It changes what it touches. Knowing this doesn't mean we should stop watching each other, but it should make us more thoughtful about how we watch and why. Whenever you feel yourself switching gears, polishing your words, or changing direction because someone's eyes are on you, take a moment. Ask yourself what's driving the shift. It might be fear, it might be habit. It might just be the ancient part of your brain trying to protect you. But now that you know the trap, you don't have to fall in without noticing. People don't always choose what's smart. They choose what feels safe. That's the hidden driver behind zero-risk bias. It's the tendency to go all in on removing one tiny risk completely, even if that decision leaves a much bigger danger untouched. It sounds counterintuitive, but it's deeply human. The illusion of control is comforting, and eliminating a risk entirely feels like we've won something concrete. Even when it makes no mathematical or strategic sense, people still prefer certainty over efficiency. Picture this: a company is updating its cybersecurity. They're presented with two options. The first reduces all system threats by 30%. The second completely eliminates one specific threat, but leaves the others untouched. Rationally, the first option is the stronger choice. It improves security across the board. But what do decision makers often choose? The second one. They choose to eliminate the single threat, not because it's the most dangerous, but because they like the finality of the word eliminate. That emotional pull toward a clean solution overrides the logic of a partial but broader fix. This happens all the time in real life. Take food safety, for example. A manufacturer spends thousands redesigning packaging to remove the possibility of a tiny contaminant that was found once in a million products. Meanwhile, they ignore wider issues in their logistics chain that pose more consistent and widespread risks. Why? Because removing a risk entirely gives them something they can point to and say, "That's fixed." It's psychologically satisfying, even if the move does little to improve overall safety. People like wins, especially ones that feel absolute. They don't want to reduce, they want to erase. It shows up in personal decisions, too. Think about someone who's terrified of flying, but drives everywhere. Statistically, driving is far more dangerous, but the idea of removing the risk of a plane crash entirely is more emotionally satisfying than reducing their overall risk by flying instead. They aren't comparing the actual numbers. They're comparing emotional reactions to two different kinds of danger. One can be fully avoided, the other just minimized. Even if the minimized one is far safer, it doesn't feel that way. There's a key phrase that helps unlock why this bias works the way it does. Risk aversion is not the same thing as risk calculation. Risk aversion lives in the body. It's visceral. You don't analyze it, you feel it. A single known risk feels more threatening than a set of unknown ones. If you can remove that known thing completely, it calms your nervous system. You feel like you've done something real. It doesn't matter if the numbers don't back it up. It feels solved. Politicians and marketers know this. They play into it all the time. A candidate might promise to completely stop one specific type of crime, even if that crime is rare. Voters respond well because they're drawn to finality. A company might advertise a product that eliminates 100% of one particular skin issue, ignoring other conditions that product does nothing for. But people trust it more than a product that improves several skin conditions by 70%. Certainty sells. That's the problem. Zero-risk bias can shape entire systems. It pushes people, companies, and governments to waste energy eliminating small, visible risks, while larger, systemic problems go unaddressed. The bias creates a kind of tunnel vision. Once something is framed as zero risk, attention locks onto it, resources follow. Political will is spent. It becomes a box people want to tick so they can feel like progress has been made. In economics, this shows up in how people insure themselves. Someone might pay for a full coverage plan that removes one rare risk entirely, while ignoring the fine print that leaves them exposed to more common losses. The full coverage plan sounds comforting. "I'm totally covered," they say, but they don't realize the trade-off they've made. Their coverage isn't comprehensive, it's skewed. It makes them feel safer while leaving them more vulnerable in practice. There's also a social layer to this bias. When leaders choose to remove a small risk completely, it gives them something simple to show their audience. They can say, "Look what we did." That's easier to communicate than explaining complex trade-offs. Voters or customers want to see results, and 100% risk removed is a powerful story. But underneath that story, there's often a hidden cost: neglected risks, misallocated funds, a false sense of security. Think about the world of health and wellness. People obsess over removing sugar entirely from their diets. They cut out every trace of it, buy sugar-free everything, and celebrate small wins. But they may still eat in a way that spikes insulin, raises inflammation, and contributes to long-term health problems. Reducing sugar moderately while improving overall nutritional quality would do more good, but the zero-sugar lifestyle feels cleaner. It's something they can declare. "I don't eat sugar" sounds like a victory. "I eat more balanced now" doesn't sound as bold. The power of zero-risk bias comes from its simplicity. Humans are drawn to closure. They don't like lingering ambiguity or partial solutions. They want to believe that problems can be fully removed. But in most of life, risk can only be managed, not eliminated. That truth is uncomfortable. It asks people to stay in a state of partial uncertainty. That takes maturity. It takes the ability to tolerate not having a clean win. There's a hidden cost to chasing full elimination. People spend more money, use more energy, and sometimes create new risks trying to kill off a single one. A school bans peanuts entirely because of one allergy case, which creates an environment of stress and fear rather than awareness and support. A neighborhood installs a dozen speed bumps to prevent a rare speeding incident, while ignoring more common safety problems like broken sidewalks. The attention narrows, and bigger dangers slip by unnoticed. In behavioral science, this bias is classified as a kind of heuristic, our brain's way of simplifying complex choices. The shortcut says, if you can erase a danger, do it. But in doing that, it skips the full cost-benefit analysis. It doesn't ask, what will this choice prevent us from doing instead? That question is essential, and it's usually left out, because the emotional win of zero pulls focus away from the analytical work of risk distribution. In digital privacy, it plays out like this. Someone installs a specific software to block one kind of data tracking completely. They feel secure, but that focus might make them ignore other practices that leak far more of their information. The blocker creates the illusion of full safety. It scratches the itch. The broader context fades into the background. Zero-risk bias is quiet. It doesn't scream like fear does. Instead, it whispers relief. It says, this one thing won't hurt you anymore. And that's all the brain needs to ease up. It's a shortcut to peace of mind. The problem is, the shortcut can lead people away from better paths. It trades clarity for comfort. It gives the illusion of control, while leaving true vulnerability untouched. Understanding this bias doesn't mean eliminating it. That would be ironic. Instead, it's about noticing when your decisions are driven by the desire to remove a fear rather than reduce a risk. It's about asking what the real goal is, peace of mind or actual safety. Those two things are not always the same. You spend an entire Saturday putting together a piece of furniture. The instructions were confusing, the screws were missing, and you swore more than once that you'd never do this again. But once it's done, you step back and admire it like it's a work of art. It wobbles a little. One of the drawers sticks, and still, you wouldn't trade it for a perfectly built, more expensive version. This is the IKEA effect. It's a term used in behavioral economics and psychology to describe the tendency for people to place a disproportionately high value on things they partially created. It's named after the Swedish furniture company IKEA, which is famous for its flat-pack furniture that customers assemble themselves. But the idea stretches far beyond Allen wrenches and bookshelves. Let's say you bake a cake from a box mix. You add a few eggs and some water, pop it in the oven, and out comes something sweet and edible. You're proud of it, even if a professional baker wouldn't be impressed. You serve it to friends and insist they try a piece. Someone might point out it tastes a little dry. Still, in your mind, it's better than the store-bought cake that's perfectly moist. That's not just sentimentality. It's psychology. The IKEA effect occurs because effort creates attachment. When we invest labor, whether physical, mental, or emotional, we begin to associate the thing we've worked on with a part of ourselves. We become biased toward it. This bias is not always obvious. You might not think you're sentimental, but you'll still favor something you worked on over something made by someone else, even when the objective quality isn't better. In a study published by Michael I. Norton, Daniel Mocon, and Dan Ariely, participants were asked to assemble simple IKEA items like storage boxes. Afterward, they were asked to assign a value to them. The researchers found that people consistently rated the items they built themselves as being worth more than identical, pre-assembled versions. They didn't just think the product was fine, they thought it was better. In another part of the same study, participants folded origami. Some made frogs, some made cranes. Regardless of how amateurish their creations were, they placed a higher value on their own folded paper than on ones folded by experts. Even when asked if they'd pay money for them, participants were willing to offer more for the ones they had created, despite their inferior quality. This doesn't just apply to physical objects. It shows up in the workplace, in parenting, and even in relationships. If you've ever led a project at work, you know how hard it is to accept feedback once it's done. You poured your time, your ideas, and your energy into it. Someone points out that the process was inefficient or the outcome could have been better. You get defensive, even if the criticism is fair. That's not ego. That's the IKEA effect in motion. The same trap can form in parenting. A child works on a school project. The parent steps in, spends hours helping with the layout, the research, and the presentation. When the teacher gives an average grade, the parent feels personally slighted. Their effort feels unrecognized, even though the project was meant to measure the child's ability. The connection between time spent and perceived value becomes distorted. There's also a version of this that happens in relationships. When people work hard to fix or build a partner, offering endless support, making sacrifices, forgiving flaws, they sometimes become more attached, not less. The effort feels like investment, and walking away becomes harder, not because the relationship is healthy, but because of the work they've put in. The idea of abandoning something they tried to build feels like failure, even when it's the best choice. This effect has implications for how we judge quality. It shows up in education. Teachers might overrate essays that show evidence of student effort, even if the final product lacks clarity. In entrepreneurship, founders can become blind to flaws in their business models because they've built the system themselves. In software, a developer might fight to keep code they wrote, even when there's a cleaner, more efficient solution. The attachment isn't just to the product, it's to the process that created it. It also helps explain why people resist change. If someone has spent years building a particular method, a workflow, or a belief system, they'll cling to it. They may even fight to preserve it, even in the face of better alternatives. This isn't always stubbornness. It's a result of emotional and cognitive labor reinforcing perceived value. That's why legacy systems stick around in organizations long after they've stopped being effective. Someone built them, someone defended them, and tearing them down feels like erasing a piece of themselves. There's a financial risk here too. The more we invest in something, money, time, or effort, the more we value it, regardless of its actual return. That's when the IKEA effect meets the sunk cost fallacy. People keep pouring resources into things that aren't working because they've already poured so much in. They might keep running a business that's failing. They might stay in a career that no longer suits them. They might keep rebuilding a car that breaks down every other week because they've already put so much work into it. The IKEA effect isn't all bad. In many cases, it drives engagement. When people build something themselves, they care more. They take ownership. That's why build your own features in apps and services are so effective. It's why gamifying learning and development can increase retention. It's why letting people personalize their workspaces, choose their projects, or design their own goals makes them more productive. Autonomy and labor combine to increase commitment. But knowing about the effect lets you step back. You can ask yourself hard questions. Do I really think this is the best version, or am I just attached because I built it? Would I feel the same way if someone else made this? Am I defending this out of pride or because it's truly valuable? The IKEA effect shows that the mind isn't objective when effort is involved. We lean toward the things we work for, even if they don't serve us anymore. And if we're not aware of it, we'll keep choosing the broken bookshelf we built over the better one right in front of us. You think you'll stay calm when someone insults you in front of a crowd. You're convinced you'll make smart choices when you're angry, tired, or hurt. But here's the trap. You're making those predictions while you're calm, rested, and safe. That's the empathy gap in action. It's not about kindness. It's about how bad we are at predicting our own behavior and emotions in a different state of mind. When you're not feeling an emotion, you underestimate its power. You can talk about fear, stress, hunger, or jealousy in a rational way, but once you're inside the feeling, your thinking shifts. Your priorities change. The version of you that exists when you're angry is not the same as the version of you right now, but your brain still tricks you into thinking you'll behave the same no matter what. Picture this. Someone says something petty to you during a meeting. You've always told yourself you'd stay professional, but in the moment, you feel heat rise in your chest, your jaw tightens, and a sarcastic reply slips out before you can stop it. You later say, "I don't know why I reacted like that." The reason is you didn't account for the gap between your calm self and your triggered self. This trap doesn't just affect how you predict your own behavior. It also distorts how you see others. If someone breaks down in tears or snaps under pressure, it's easy to judge from the outside. You forget what it's like to feel what they're feeling. You think, why can't they just control themselves? That question only makes sense when you're not feeling what they're feeling. When you are, everything looks different. The empathy gap shows up in everyday life in subtle ways. Let's say you're at the grocery store and you've just eaten. You're full. You're more likely to think you don't need snacks for later. You'll walk right past the chips and chocolate. Later, when hunger hits, you'll wish you hadn't. This gap between your full self and your hungry self changes the decisions you make. The same thing happens with emotions. You plan a conversation with your partner assuming you'll stay calm, but when they say something that touches a nerve, the plan evaporates. This gap can break down communication. When people argue, each person assumes the other should see things clearly. But stress, anger, or fear narrow the way we think. We focus on defending ourselves. We lose interest in listening. When one person says, "just calm down," it rarely works. That's because the brain in an emotional state doesn't respond well to logic. It wants to feel safe first. One of the most dangerous effects of the empathy gap is in how we prepare for situations. Think about someone making a public speech. They rehearse calmly at home and believe they're ready. But when the actual moment comes, nerves spike, their voice shakes, and their mind goes blank. They had no idea how much anxiety would affect them. If they had practiced in a slightly stressful setting, like in front of a few friends, they might have closed that gap. The empathy gap also affects how we prepare for temptation. When you're not tempted, you believe you'll resist, so you underestimate how strong the craving will be. Someone trying to quit smoking might think they can keep cigarettes in the house for a guest and not touch them. Someone recovering from alcohol might agree to meet friends at a bar, thinking they'll just drink soda. But once the cue is present and the emotional trigger hits, willpower often falls short. The planning failed because the planner didn't factor in the future emotional state. Parents often fall into the empathy gap with their children. A calm parent thinks, if my kid throws a tantrum, I'll just wait it out. But when the screaming starts in a public place, embarrassment, frustration, and anxiety flood in. That calm plan fades. The parent snaps, gives in, or gets angry. Later, they regret it. Again, the calm version of them couldn't predict how strong the emotional version would be. In relationships, the empathy gap fuels misunderstanding. One partner might downplay the other's fears or stress. They say things like, "It's not a big deal," or "just relax." These aren't cruel statements. They come from someone who isn't feeling what the other person is feeling. From a neutral place, the issue doesn't seem urgent. But when someone is overwhelmed, hearing those words feels dismissive. It makes them feel alone. The gap between what one person feels and what the other imagines is too wide. Even the legal system falls into this trap. Judges and jurors sometimes struggle to grasp what someone was thinking during a crime. A person in a rage might act in a way that seems irrational in court. People say, "Why didn't they just walk away?" Or, "That doesn't make sense." But those judgments come from a calm, analytical place. They overlook the storm happening inside someone's head in a high-emotion moment. We also misjudge how people make choices under fear. When someone freezes or obeys a dangerous order under threat, observers say, "I would never do that." That belief comes from not being afraid in that moment. Under fear, people often shut down or comply. It's not cowardice, it's biology. But the empathy gap hides that truth. It makes us overestimate how rational we'd be in someone else's crisis. This bias isn't about selfishness or cruelty. It's about how the brain changes across emotional states. Your priorities, your sense of time, your judgment, everything gets reshuffled. And yet, when you're outside that state, you think the shift won't be that strong. This is why people don't plan for burnout until they're already burned out. It's why someone agrees to a packed schedule and only realizes too late that they're exhausted. Their rested brain couldn't picture the future tired one. To work around the empathy gap, you have to build habits when you're calm that will support you when you're not. You can't rely on making good choices in the heat of the moment if you haven't already prepared for it. This might mean writing down what to do when you're angry, setting boundaries before you're pressured, or creating distance between you and temptation before it strikes. You can also practice imagining situations from a past emotional state. Think back to a time you were jealous, afraid, or overwhelmed. What did you do that didn't make sense later? That memory is a small bridge across the empathy gap. It reminds you how different your mind can be under pressure. Awareness helps. If you know the gap exists, you're more likely to pause before judging others. You're more likely to plan better with less blind optimism. And maybe, when someone else is caught in a wave of emotion, you'll meet them with a little more patience, knowing that from their side, everything looks different. You look at the world and think you're just seeing things as they are. You trust your own eyes, your own ears, and especially your own thoughts. They feel like the truth. But here's the trap: naive realism. It's the quiet belief that you see reality clearly while everyone else is somehow mistaken, biased, or emotional. You don't think of yourself as having a skewed view. You just assume you're being rational. This bias hides in plain sight. You won't know you're doing it. That's the point. When someone disagrees with you on politics, religion, values, or even how to load a dishwasher, you don't always think, maybe they're seeing it from a different lens. No. What actually happens, even if you don't say it out loud, is something closer to, they don't get it. Maybe you think they're misinformed, or too emotional, or just not that smart. You tell yourself, if only they had the facts I have, they'd agree with me. That's naive realism at work. Let's slow down and look at how this plays out in real life. Say you're having a discussion with someone about climate change. You bring data. You reference reports. You make what feels like a logical case. The other person pushes back with skepticism. You feel frustrated. It seems obvious to you, so you decide they're being stubborn or they're stuck in some ideology. But here's what you likely didn't consider. They think the same thing about you. They believe they're seeing it clearly. They're not playing games in their head. They honestly believe they've got a hold of the truth. They probably think you're the one being led by emotion or blind spots. Now you've got two people both convinced they're right, both thinking the other one is biased. That's the trap closing in. This shows up in relationships too, not just debates. You and your partner argue about something simple, who's doing more chores, let's say. You feel like you're always cleaning, always picking up the slack. You have examples. You have mental receipts. Meanwhile, your partner feels the same way. They feel underappreciated. They've got their own list. You both think the facts are on your side. You both think you're being fair. The argument spirals because neither of you can see your own lens. Only theirs seems tinted. Naive realism isn't just about arrogance. It's about misjudging how much your mind shapes what you see. Your past experiences, your values, your stress level, even how much sleep you got. All of that filters your perception. But instead of noticing the filter, you think you're seeing through a clear window. It's a simple but deep illusion. Research backs this up. Social psychologists like Lee Ross have studied this for decades. In one experiment, people were shown the same footage of a protest. One group thought it was a peaceful demonstration. Another thought it was threatening. The footage never changed, just the context they were told before watching. Yet both groups were sure they were being objective. Both thought the other side was clearly wrong or biased. The researchers didn't have to tell them how naive realism worked. The participants lived it, without knowing it had a name. This isn't about being dumb. In fact, smart people can fall even deeper into the trap. They're better at arguing. They can gather evidence faster. They know how to make their case look airtight. But they're still standing on the same mental platform. I see things as they are. That platform is shaky, even if the argument sounds strong. Here's another way it shows up. News media. You watch your preferred channel and think, this seems balanced. You flip to another and think, how do people fall for this nonsense? What's really happening isn't that one side is neutral and the other is outrageous. What's happening is that each is presenting a version of reality that aligns with a certain worldview. If you share that worldview, it feels like truth. If you don't, it feels like propaganda. But if you can step back and see the frame around the picture, not just the picture itself, you start to notice how much of it is construction, not raw fact. The same goes for moral disagreements. If someone doesn't share your values, your first instinct might be to judge their character. You might think they're cold, or unfeeling, or maybe too idealistic. What's harder is recognizing that they're working from a different internal compass. They're not broken. They're just seeing with different coordinates. But naive realism blocks that realization. It tells you that your compass is true north. There's also something dangerous about naive realism in larger systems. In politics, it fuels polarization. When each side believes it's objective, compromise feels like betrayal. You're not just disagreeing with someone, you're disagreeing with reality as you see it. That makes every debate a high-stakes game. You're not defending an opinion, you're defending truth. That's why conversations turn into fights, and why changing someone's mind rarely works with just facts. Because to them, you're not offering clarity, you're offering distortion. Even in the workplace, naive realism plays a role. Say a project fails. You might blame your coworkers' decisions. You saw the red flags. You would have handled it better. But maybe they thought the same thing about you. Maybe they were acting on information you didn't have. You both walk away feeling like the reasonable one, and the tension grows. Once you spot this pattern, you start to see it everywhere. In group chats, in comment sections, at family dinners. People argue past each other, not because they don't care, but because they honestly think they're each on the side of reason. And unless someone in the room steps out of that mindset, the conversation will stay locked in a loop. So what breaks the loop? It's not about giving up your views. It's about recognizing that your view is a view, not the view. It's about understanding that perception feels like truth, but it isn't the whole truth. When someone disagrees, instead of assuming they're lost or misinformed, you ask, what might be shaping their lens? That one question can open doors. Not always, not instantly, but it shifts the tone. It makes you a little less rigid. And in a world full of rigid thinking, that's a real advantage. Naive realism doesn't scream for attention. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits quietly in the background, whispering that you're the clear-eyed one. It's subtle. That's what makes it powerful. And that's why noticing it, even once, can change how you move through arguments, relationships, and even your own thoughts. You read a personality test online. It says you're sensitive but strong when needed. You care deeply about others, but sometimes struggle to let people in. You've got a creative side, and although you doubt yourself now and then, you're capable of great things. You nod along. That's me, you think. That's so accurate. But here's the twist. That same exact description was just shown to 10 strangers before you, and every single one of them said the same thing, that it described them perfectly too. This is the Forer effect. It's the reason vague personality descriptions feel personal, even when they're generic. Psychologist Bertram Forer discovered it in 1948 when he gave his students a personality quiz and then handed each of them a unique analysis based on their answers. What he didn't tell them was that every student got the exact same description. He asked them to rate how accurate it felt on a scale from 0 to 5. The average score? 4.26. That's a near-perfect match for a statement that wasn't personalized at all. The Forer effect tricks us into thinking we're being seen. It preys on our desire to feel known, to feel like someone has figured us out. When we read something about ourselves, especially when it's flattering, we lean in. We relate to it, we make it fit, and we rarely stop to ask whether the description could apply just as well to someone else. You'll see this effect everywhere, in horoscopes, in personality quizzes shared on social media, in job assessments that tell you you're a visionary leader or a calm strategist, even in fortune cookies. The language is just vague enough to feel universal, but just specific enough to feel personal. Statements like, you have a strong need for others to like you, but you can be critical of yourself. Or, you sometimes doubt whether you made the right decision. These apply to almost everyone. But the real trick lies in how your brain processes that information. Instead of analyzing whether the statement could apply to most people, you focus on the parts that feel especially true for you. You ignore the parts that don't fit. You do this without realizing it. It's a bias built into the way we interpret language and experience. Let's say you read a line like, "You often keep your feelings to yourself." You think about last week when you didn't tell your friend how annoyed you were. You say to yourself, "That's exactly what I do." You don't think about the times you did speak up or the times you overshared. Your brain locks onto the memory that confirms the statement. This is a cousin to confirmation bias, where we look for evidence that supports what we already believe and ignore what doesn't. The Forer effect doesn't just show up in silly social media quizzes. It can have real consequences in the way we view ourselves and others. Take astrology, for example. If a horoscope tells you that today you'll face a challenge but come out stronger, you'll probably find a way to make that true. You'll assign meaning to whatever happens during your day, a tough conversation, a flat tire, an annoying customer, and tie it back to what you read. You filter your experience through that lens, even if it wasn't meant for you in the first place. In job interviews, people often put too much trust in personality tests that feel insightful. Some companies use tools like the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator to guide hiring or team dynamics. You might get told you're an INTJ or an ENFP, and the profile that comes with that label feels spot on. But these categories are often built on general traits that could apply across many types. The Forer effect helps these categories feel more precise than they really are. Even psychics and cold readers rely on this. They'll start with a broad statement like, "You're carrying emotional weight from your past," or "You've been feeling uncertain lately." Most people will identify with those ideas, but because the message feels personal and private, it gains power. It becomes harder to question. Once you know this effect exists, you start noticing it more. You hear a song lyric and think it describes your life. You read a book and feel like the character is speaking directly to you. That feeling isn't wrong. Humans are meaning-making machines. But it's important to understand how easily we can be fooled by generalities dressed up as insights. Let's take another example. You're handed a description that says, "You value honesty, but you don't always share everything you're thinking. You try to be fair to others, but sometimes you feel misunderstood. You enjoy being alone, but also like meaningful connection." That could describe almost anyone. It's neither specific nor measurable, but it sounds introspective. It sounds like something a therapist might say. So your guard goes down and you assume it's accurate. This is where the trap tightens. The more we buy into these vague profiles, the more we rely on them to make decisions. If a quiz tells you you're bad at conflict, you might avoid confrontation, even if it's something you could learn to manage. If a type tells you you're introverted, you might decline opportunities that scare you, even when those experiences could help you grow. It gets even stickier when these profiles influence how others treat you. A manager who thinks you're the quiet, analytical type might pass you over for leadership roles. A partner who reads that you're emotionally distant might assume you'll never change. Labels stick, and if those labels are built on vague, Forer-style statements, then the picture they create is a distortion. The Forer effect doesn't mean all personality assessments are useless. Some are based on robust data and meaningful patterns. But the moment a description relies on soft language, generalities, or traits that sound good no matter who you are, you should pause. Ask yourself, could this apply to almost anyone? Is it telling me something new, or just telling me something I want to hear? Awareness is the first defense. When you feel that spark of recognition, that moment of, "That's so me," take a beat. Look at the language. Look for the vagueness hiding in what feels like insight. Break it apart. Ask yourself if you'd still think it was true if it was said about someone else. Most of us want to be understood. That's human. But being understood starts with honest reflection, not recycled templates dressed up as revelations. The Forer effect is a quiet trickster. It whispers truths that aren't really true. The more we notice its voice, the less it can shape how we see ourselves. We hear about the garage startups that turned into billion-dollar empires. We see the YouTubers who blew up overnight. We read about the athletes who beat all odds and became champions. These stories flood our feeds, our books, and our conversations. But there's something off. Not wrong exactly, but incomplete. There's a quiet crowd left out of the spotlight. That's where survivorship bias hides. It shows up when we only pay attention to the people or things that made it through a process, and we ignore the ones that didn't. It's a mental blind spot, and it's sneaky. You don't notice it's there until your judgment starts to tilt. You see only the winners, not the full picture. And that can seriously mess with your decisions, your expectations, and your sense of what's realistic. Let's say you're thinking of dropping everything to start a business. You read about the founder who dropped out of college, built something in their dorm, and became a millionaire at 25. That story's everywhere. It feels inspiring. It might even feel like proof that this is the path. But what you don't hear are the thousands of others who also dropped out, built something, and ended up broke, burned out, or buried in debt. Their stories are missing, not because they didn't exist, but because nobody wrote about them. That's survivorship bias in action. This bias tricks you into thinking that success is more likely than it actually is. And it's not just about business. It shows up in health, finance, education, fitness, almost any area of life where outcomes get attention. During World War II, military analysts looked at planes returning from missions. They saw bullet holes clustered in the wings and tail, so they suggested adding armor in those spots. But one statistician, Abraham Wald, pointed out something critical. These were the planes that made it back. The real weak spots were where the returning planes weren't hit, because the ones that got hit in those areas never made it back at all. The damage you don't see often tells you more than the damage you do. Survivorship bias thrives on silence. It filters out failure. It makes it seem like success is just a matter of hustle or mindset, when in reality, luck, timing, and conditions you can't control play massive roles. Think about all the people who invested in crypto after seeing others post huge wins online. The stories of people who lost everything, not as widely shared, but they're just as real, maybe even more common. The bias doesn't lie, it just hides things. Even in education, this shows up. Some people say, I didn't go to college and I turned out fine. Maybe they did, but they might be outliers. For every successful person without a degree, there may be dozens who struggled without that foundation. If we base our decisions only on the loudest or most visible examples, we miss the quieter, more common realities. The entertainment industry is another good example. We hear about the actor who moved to LA, waited tables, then booked a lead role. We think, maybe if I go all in, it'll work for me too. But we don't hear from the thousands who waited tables for years, auditioned over and over, and never got a call back. They're not failures, they're just invisible in the narrative. And without their stories, the whole picture is skewed. Survivorship bias isn't just about being misled by others. It can happen in your own mind. You might look back at your choices and say, this method worked for me, without realizing that it might not work for everyone, or even that it might not work again for you. It can make you overconfident in your methods, your instincts, or your track record. You focus on your wins and forget about your close calls, your lucky breaks, or the times it almost didn't work out. There's also a danger in how we give advice. People who succeed are often asked, "What's your secret?" And they answer honestly, based on their experience. But their experience is filtered by survivorship. They may not realize that others did the same things and didn't get the same results. When you ask the winners, you're only getting half the data. We all love success stories. They're hopeful. They make us feel like we're in control. But stories are not statistics. One story can't tell you about probability, and a handful of examples can't show you the full range of outcomes. If you make a choice based only on the visible winners, you might be stepping into a trap without knowing it. Let's say a fitness influencer posts about how a certain diet changed their life. They show before and after photos, meal plans, and glowing testimonials. It seems legit, but how many people followed the same plan and saw no results, or got injured, or developed an unhealthy relationship with food? That's not in the post. The ones for whom it didn't work simply don't show up. They don't trend, but they exist and they matter. In investing, This bias can be devastating. You hear about the people who made millions from meme stocks. You don't hear as much from the ones who bought high, held on, and lost half their savings. Survivorship bias makes you believe that good outcomes are more common than they actually are. It tempts you to jump in, thinking the odds are in your favor when they might not be. This bias even affects how we view history. We study the countries that thrived after major events, but forget the ones that didn't. We look at the companies that weathered crises, but ignore the ones that collapsed. The full dataset is messy. Survivorship bias edits it down to a highlight reel, and we make decisions based on that. To fight this bias, you need to ask different questions. Not just, what did successful people do, but how many did the same thing and failed? Not just, what worked, but what didn't and why. You need to hunt for the invisible. Look at the absence, not just the presence. That's where the truth lives. Think about a friend who beat the odds. Maybe they started late in a career and still made it big. Maybe they overcame a serious setback and came out stronger. Their story is powerful, but if you use that story as a blueprint, without considering all the others who didn't beat the odds, you risk setting yourself up for disappointment. It's not about doubting success. It's about measuring it accurately. This doesn't mean you shouldn't try or take risks. It means you should take them with your eyes open. Understand the full landscape, not just the well-lit parts. Know that the stories you don't hear can teach you just as much as the ones you do. And if you're going to learn from the survivors, at least ask, who didn't survive and what happened to them? Survivorship bias isn't dramatic. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It hides behind the loud examples and tells you that what you see is all there is. But once you notice it, you start to see the gaps. You start to hear the silence. And that's when your judgment gets sharper. Not colder, just clearer. You trip over your words during a presentation. Your voice shakes. You drop your pen. For a split second, you're sure you've ruined it. But what if that small slip-up made your audience like you more? The Pratfall Effect is a psychological phenomenon where people see you as more likable and relatable when you show small imperfections. It doesn't work if you're already struggling with competence, then the mistake just confirms a problem. But if you're already seen as capable or confident, a small error softens the edges. It makes people lean in rather than pull away. Let's say you're interviewing for a job. You're dressed well, your answers are clear, you've done your research. But halfway through, you accidentally knock over your water bottle. You apologize and keep going without letting it throw you off. Most people assume that moment hurt your chances. In reality, research shows it probably helped you. That one mistake made you seem more human, less scripted, more honest. The interviewer feels a shift. They were speaking to a strong candidate before, but now they're speaking to someone real. The Pratfall Effect was first studied in the 1960s by social psychologist Elliot Aronson. He ran experiments with participants who listened to recordings of people answering quiz questions. One group heard a contestant who performed well, then spilled coffee at the end of the recording. The other group heard the same performance without the blunder. The result? People liked the coffee spilling version more. They still respected their skill, but the minor accident made them more approachable. It's not just job interviews or experiments. Think about celebrities or leaders you admire. When they admit a flaw or stumble in public, something minor, not career-ending, it often makes them more relatable, not less. Take a high-profile CEO who mispronounces a word during a speech. If the rest of the talk is solid, that small mistake doesn't damage their credibility. It breaks the tension in the room. It reminds people this person is human too. People are drawn to that mix of competence and vulnerability. This effect plays out in dating too. Someone might appear attractive, polished, confident, maybe too much so. Then they laugh at their own mistake, or admit they forgot something trivial, or nervously drop their keys. That one moment might be what turns admiration into connection. A perfect person feels distant, a slightly imperfect person feels real. But it only works if there's competence to begin with. If someone appears disorganized, unprepared, or insecure, a blunder doesn't help. It confirms doubts. Think of a student giving a shaky presentation and also forgetting their slides. No one's thinking, wow, so relatable. They're thinking, this person didn't prepare. That's the line where the Pratfall Effect stops working. You can't lean on flaws to carry the weight of substance. The charm comes from contrast, not from chaos. This also shows up in branding and public speaking. A polished video ad with a single unscripted laugh or slip-up feels more trustworthy than a flawless robotic message. The moment something feels too curated, too clean, audiences pull back. We're wired to notice authenticity. Small cracks in the surface help us believe what we're seeing is real. Now imagine you're training someone at work. You're experienced. You know the software, the system, the protocols. You're walking them through a task and you misclick. You don't panic. You say, missed that one, happens to the best of us, and carry on. You've just taught them two things: the task, and that it's okay to be human. That small slip made your guidance feel more accessible. It told them you don't expect perfection, you expect effort. People in leadership often miss this. They think they have to be flawless to earn respect. But perfection builds distance. It silences feedback. When you act like you never get it wrong, people stop telling you when something is wrong. They fear your reaction. They fear looking weak. Leaders who show vulnerability in small ways, admitting they forgot a name, saying they're nervous before a big meeting, laughing when they mess up a slide, those are the ones people trust. Not because they're flawless, but because they're real. The trap is in trying to manufacture imperfection. Once it feels like a strategy, the effect disappears. The power of the Pratfall Effect comes from genuine mistakes. You can't force authenticity. If you're too calculated, it becomes a performance, and people notice. There's also a gendered lens to this. In some situations, men are socially allowed more room for small blunders to be endearing. Women, especially in male-dominated fields, may feel pressured to avoid any sign of weakness or slip. The same mistake, like forgetting a detail or tripping over a word, can be read differently depending on who makes it. That doesn't change the underlying effect, but it changes how it plays out in the world. Social expectations color perception. The real value in understanding the Pratfall Effect isn't in trying to be clumsy. It's in letting go of the pressure to always appear flawless. It's recognizing that when people see your imperfections, they often connect with you more, not less. You still aim for skill, for professionalism. But when the inevitable slip happens, you don't spiral, you don't shrink, you just keep going. There's a kind of quiet confidence in being okay with not being perfect. It tells people you're competent enough that a little stumble doesn't shake you. And that's what makes others feel safe around you. Because if you're not rattled by your own mistakes, they don't have to be either. We often think people like us despite our flaws, but sometimes they like us because of them. Not the big, toxic ones, the little cracks, the things that show we're trying, not performing. The truth is, no one relates to perfect. We relate to effort, to recovery, to sincerity. The Pratfall Effect is not a trick. It's a reflection of something deeper. That connection isn't built on perfection, but on shared humanness. And once you stop hiding behind the need to get it right, that's when people really start listening. You walk into a supermarket to buy a simple bottle of shampoo. There's a shelf stretching 12 feet long. On it, dozens of colorful bottles scream for your attention. Some promise volume, some offer moisture. Others are for curly hair, straight hair, dyed hair, sensitive scalps, oily roots, dry ends, or all of the above. You stare, you hesitate, you read a few labels, but they blur together. After 10 minutes, you either grab the same brand you always use or leave without buying anything. That's not just indecision. That's the choice overload trap at work. The human brain can only process so much at one time. When you face too many options, it doesn't free you, it locks you up. You think you're getting more freedom. In reality, your mind hits a wall. You weigh tiny differences that don't matter. You try to predict future satisfaction. You feel a rising sense of pressure to make the right choice. The longer you look, the worse it gets. This pressure builds into paralysis. Eventually, you either make no decision or choose something random just to end the discomfort. Then afterwards, you doubt yourself. Let's say you want to buy a pair of headphones online. You scroll through dozens of models. Each one has slightly different specs: battery life, bass depth, touch controls, water resistance, call clarity. Some have noise canceling, others don't. Some are on sale. Some have 4.6 stars, others have 4.8 stars with 1,000 fewer reviews. You start opening tabs, you go down a YouTube rabbit hole of reviews. After an hour, you still haven't made a decision. Your cart is empty. You tell yourself you'll come back to it tomorrow. You won't. Choice overload doesn't just show up in consumer decisions. It creeps into everyday life. Dating apps are a perfect example. Swipe after swipe, face after face, option after option. In theory, more matches should mean more chances to connect. But people often report feeling overwhelmed and disengaged. They stop replying, they lose interest, they start to treat people like data points instead of human beings. The endless pool of choices creates a feeling that there's always someone better just one swipe away. It becomes hard to commit to any one person, not because there's a problem with them, but because the mind gets flooded with too many signals. In the workplace, the same thing happens with tasks. A person sits down in the morning with 15 things on their to-do list. They bounce between emails, messages, meeting notes, drafts, dashboards, and notifications. They make a little progress on many things, but finish nothing. Their attention gets pulled in too many directions. Prioritizing becomes harder, not easier, as the list grows. By the end of the day, they feel like they worked hard, but got nothing done. That's a mental freeze caused by too many inputs, not laziness. Studies back this up. A well-known experiment offered people either 6 jam flavors or 24. With 24, more people stopped to browse. But when it came time to buy, those who saw fewer options were 10 times more likely to make a purchase. It wasn't that they didn't like choice, it was that too much choice caused a stall. The paradox is clear. More options reduce action. Choice overload isn't about being indecisive. It's about friction. Every additional option adds a mental cost. You compare more features, you hold more details in your short-term memory, you think harder about what might go wrong. That burden piles up quickly. Even if you make a decision, you're more likely to regret it. Not because it was a bad choice, but because you can't stop thinking about the alternatives. You wonder what you missed. That creates buyer's remorse. Not from poor outcomes, but from imagined better ones. This trap shows up in parenting too. A child is asked what they want for dinner. Their parent lists 10 different meals. The child stalls. They go quiet, they say, "I don't know." The parent gets frustrated, but the problem isn't the child. It's the overload. Had the parent offered 2 options, spaghetti or grilled cheese, the child could have picked one. Too many choices creates anxiety, even in kids, especially in kids. Choice overload also drives procrastination. A college student has to write a paper. The professor gave a list of 20 possible topics. The student spends hours trying to choose the best one. They read summaries, they take notes, they make pros and cons lists, but they don't start writing. The deadline creeps up. They finally pick something under pressure. That delay isn't because they're lazy. It's because they had too many ways to begin. Sometimes people think they're being smart by gathering more and more options. They browse every site, they read every review, they ask every friend for advice. They feel like they're doing their homework. But often, they're just delaying. Underneath all that research is fear. Fear of missing out, fear of choosing wrong, fear of regret. So they keep hunting, not realizing that more options don't calm the fear, they feed it. You might think that this trap only hits big decisions, buying a house, picking a career, choosing a school, but it works on small decisions too. What to wear, what to watch, what to order for lunch. People spend 10 minutes scrolling through a streaming service and end up watching nothing. Not because there was nothing good, but because there was too much. That blank stare at the screen, remote in hand, is the symptom. In relationships, the trap goes deeper. People wonder whether they're with the right person, not because the relationship is bad, but because there are so many other lives they could be living. Social media floods them with glimpses of other people's partners, travels, and milestones. This creates an illusion of endless possibilities. The mind wanders, not out of dissatisfaction, but out of mental saturation. Too many paths to consider, too many hypotheticals. That fog of options can dull the appreciation for what's right in front of you. Choice overload is especially cruel because it hides behind good intentions. You think you're being thorough. You think you're keeping your options open. But that open door can become a trap door. You sink into a loop of overthinking, hesitating, and second-guessing. Decisions become exhausting. Not because the options are bad, but because there are too many of them. The internet made this worse. Every click opens another tab. Every product has thousands of reviews. Every decision feels like a puzzle you need to solve perfectly. You're no longer choosing between good and bad. You're choosing between 20 different shades of good. That's harder. That requires a kind of mental precision humans aren't built for. So what's happening here is not about weakness. It's not about lacking discipline. It's about limits. The human brain works best within boundaries. Too many options create noise. That noise becomes static. That static makes it harder to hear your own judgment. You start outsourcing decisions to algorithms, top 10 lists, best of articles, or the crowd. You stop asking what you want and start asking what others picked. That's not freedom, that's overload, and it's not always obvious. People don't walk around saying, "I'm overwhelmed by choice." They say, "I can't decide." They say, "I'll think about it later." They say, "I'm still researching." But underneath all that hesitation is the same root. Too much input, too little clarity. You might not feel it every day, but it's there, in your closet, in your streaming queue, in your unread tabs, in your half-finished carts, in your hesitation to commit. It's quiet. And when you start to notice it, you realize how many moments you've paused, not because you lacked options, but because you had too many. You're in a heated conversation with someone, and they say something that doesn't make sense to you at all. You pause and think, why would anyone believe that? But here's the thing. Deep down, you're not really wondering why they think that. You're wondering why they don't think like you. That's projection bias. It slips in quietly and makes you believe that your current thoughts, emotions, and preferences are shared by everyone else, or that they should be. It doesn't just happen in arguments or debates. It shows up when you're making decisions for others, giving advice, managing people, or even just making weekend plans with a friend. Let's say it's a cold Saturday morning. You're feeling sluggish, and you decide not to go to the gym. You assume your gym buddy probably feels the same way, so you cancel on them. But they text back and say they were already on the way. That disconnect, the moment where you realize you guessed wrong, is a snapshot of how projection bias works. You assumed their mindset matched yours. You believed your state was the baseline. This bias gets even trickier when we're making decisions on behalf of someone else. Parents do this with their kids, bosses do it with employees, partners do it with each other all the time. You might think, if I were them, I'd definitely want a quiet night in, and then feel confused or even hurt when they say they'd rather go out. You're not just reacting to their decision, you're reacting to your own mental model being rejected. It's easy to confuse projection bias with empathy, but they're not the same. Empathy asks, what might they be feeling right now? Projection bias assumes they must be feeling what I feel. One is about asking questions and staying open. The other quietly replaces someone else's mind with your own. This isn't always about emotions either. It shows up in how we predict future behavior. Take a simple example. You're at the grocery store and you're hungry. You buy way more food than you usually do. You might even pick up snacks you don't normally eat. Your future self, the one who will be eating those groceries all week, isn't hungry. But right now, you project your current state onto that future self. You think, yeah, I'll want 3 bags of chips by Thursday. The truth? You probably won't. That's projection bias again, this time aimed at your future self. In the workplace, this bias can get in the way of good leadership. A manager might say, if I were in their shoes, I'd just speak up. But they're not in their shoes. Maybe the employee has a different background, different anxieties, or less power in the room. The manager thinks they're offering insight, but really, they're just projecting their own comfort with conflict onto someone else. That misjudgment can lead to poor decisions, broken trust, or advice that backfires. Even in friendships, this bias can distort well-meant gestures. You might plan a surprise party because you love surprises. You might give a gift that you would want. But if the other person prefers low-key celebrations or practical gifts, your thoughtful act might land awkwardly. You walk away wondering why they didn't light up the way you expected. Again, it's not about selfishness. It's about projection. You didn't ask what they'd want. You assumed they'd want what you would. In relationships, Projection bias can wear many disguises. You might assume your partner feels loved when you do something meaningful for them, like running errands or making coffee in the morning. But maybe what makes them feel loved is quality time or verbal affirmation. If you never ask and always assume, you'll be giving without connecting. You'll be trying hard and still missing the mark. One place projection bias thrives is in political or social arguments. When people say things like, "I just don't see how anyone could think that way," they're often projecting. The assumption is that if something feels obvious to them, it should feel obvious to everyone. But perspectives come from history, upbringing, fear, exposure, trauma. They don't all start in the same place. Assuming they do creates a kind of tunnel vision, one that can harden into judgment and distance. Marketing departments fall into this trap all the time. A team sits around a table and asks, "Would I buy this?" If they all say yes, they think they have a winner. But the people in that room might not represent the customer base. They're often more informed, more financially stable, more invested in the product category. What they value might be irrelevant to the people they're trying to reach. But again, projection bias whispers, "If I think this is cool, others will too." Even educators can run into this bias. A teacher might assume a student didn't do well on an assignment because they didn't care. Why? Because that's what the teacher would have to feel to perform at that level. But the student might be dealing with stress, sleep deprivation, or a learning difference. The teacher's mental model isn't wrong, it's just not universal. But projection bias doesn't warn you when your assumptions are off base, it just makes them feel reasonable. You see it in tech design too. A team builds an app interface that feels intuitive to them, but that's because they designed it. They know every screen, every button. A new user might find it confusing or too fast or cluttered. That's not a failure of the user. It's a failure to see outside the developer's head. That's projection bias, writing the user experience. Even small moments show how deep this bias runs. You text a friend and don't hear back for a day. If you're feeling insecure, you might assume they're mad. If you're busy and unbothered, you might not think about it at all. The story you tell yourself depends more on your state than on their behavior. And without checking in, you'll probably keep believing your own version. Projection bias matters because it creates invisible barriers between people. You think you're relating, but you're actually replacing someone's perspective with your own. And you won't even notice because it doesn't feel like guessing. It feels like knowing. You believe you're reading the room when in fact you're just hearing echoes of your own thoughts. So what do you do with that? You pause before assuming. You ask instead of guessing. You separate your current state from the one you're predicting or interpreting. You build mental space between what I feel and what they might feel. And you let go of the quiet certainty that your brain's version is the default one. That doesn't mean second-guessing yourself at every turn. It just means noticing when your thoughts start with, "Well, I would..." That sentence can lead to insight, or it can lead to assumption. The difference is whether you stop to ask if the person in front of you is thinking like you, or if they're walking through a different map entirely. Projection bias doesn't make you selfish. It makes you human, but unchecked, it keeps you talking to mirrors instead of people. And the cost of that is real connection. You walk into a meeting about a multi-million-dollar project. The team has 1 hour, but somehow half of that hour slips away, arguing over what color the bike shed should be outside the office. No one's touched the budget. No one's questioned the core deliverables. The hardest problems are sitting untouched in the corner like a pile of unread reports. That's the law of triviality in motion. This trap shows up everywhere. People fixate on the simple, surface-level decisions because they're easier to understand, easier to talk about, and safer to engage with. It feels productive, but it's not. What's actually happening is avoidance. The complex issues, where real risks and rewards live, require effort, expertise, and often discomfort. So people unconsciously slide into the comfort of talking about things they already know how to handle. The shade of blue for a logo, the font size in a document, whether to put snacks in the break room. All of it feels like work, and none of it moves the needle. The term bike shedding comes from a story about a committee meeting. The group is reviewing plans for a nuclear power plant. It skips past the reactor design in minutes, but then it spends 45 minutes arguing about a bike shed for the plant workers. Everyone has an opinion on a bike shed. Almost no one understands nuclear reactors. The result? The big problem, the one that actually matters, goes unchallenged. This is a mental shortcut. The brain naturally prefers easier cognitive tasks over harder ones. It's the same reason people sometimes clean their desk before starting a big assignment. Tidying the desk gives a sense of control. It's doable. It delivers a quick win, but it's a substitute for the hard work. The trap is dangerous because it doesn't feel like a trap. It feels like useful discussion. And it's not limited to committees or corporate spaces. It shows up in startups, in classrooms, in family decisions. A tech team might spend an hour debating which task manager to use, Trello or Asana, without ever defining their project's roadmap. A parent might obsess over what color backpack their child should take to school, while not addressing the child's struggles with math or anxiety. It's not that small decisions don't matter. It's that they steal time and focus when they're allowed to dominate. In one example, a nonprofit board spent weeks debating the design of a donation box. What material, what slot shape, what wording. Meanwhile, the real issue, why donations were dropping year over year, was barely touched. The law kicks in when people lack the skill, confidence, or energy to tackle the complex issues. When those deeper problems require confronting uncertainty, people hesitate. It's safer to sound smart discussing something concrete. You'll rarely be judged for over-participating in a discussion about coffee cups in the office kitchen. You might be judged or challenged if you question the direction of the product or raise concerns about the financial model. So we default to comfort. One study looked at meetings across several industries. Analysts found that, on average, people spent more time on decisions under $5,000 than on ones over $100,000. The logic? The smaller decisions felt more accessible. Everyone had a stake. Everyone could understand the context. But that inclusiveness comes at a cost. Group time is not infinite. Every minute spent tweaking something minor is a minute lost from tackling strategic decisions. There's also a fear factor. Complex problems carry the risk of being wrong. Most people don't like to appear uninformed. That fear of exposure leads them to stay silent on the big stuff and vocal on the little things. This social dynamic reinforces the trap. Once a few people start discussing the easy topic, others follow, and the group drifts further from the hard conversation. No one wants to be the one who derails the flow, so the real work gets kicked down the road. You can even see this on a personal level. Someone might spend hours reorganizing their to-do list app. They'll test fonts, color schemes, and category tags. All of that gives the illusion of productivity. But they haven't written the report they've been avoiding. They haven't made the phone call that actually matters. The law doesn't need a group. One mind is enough to bike shed its way through an entire afternoon. In software development, this is painfully common. A team might debate where to place a button in the user interface. Meanwhile, the backend is fragile, the security is untested, and the database is a mess. The conversation is stuck in the visible, tangible parts of the product, even when the unseen architecture is crumbling. Again, the surface feels safer. It's also worth noting how the law of triviality thrives in environments that lack clear leadership or structured priorities. When there's no one to redirect the focus, meetings become open loops. Everyone contributes their thoughts, and the group floats from one accessible detail to another. Without someone saying, "Let's get back to the core issue," the conversation becomes a sandbox for low-stakes debate. In political discussions, you see this too. A community might fixate on whether a new sign should say, "Welcome to our town," or "Our town welcomes you." Meanwhile, housing costs, infrastructure decay, and public safety get sidelined. It's not that people don't care about the hard problems, it's that the trivial ones are more emotionally manageable. They give people a sense of control and participation without the burden of deep consequences. This dynamic can even be weaponized. A skilled manipulator might steer a group toward trivial discussions on purpose to avoid scrutiny or stall progress. They flood the agenda with small items, drowning out anything that threatens their position or interests. The group walks away feeling like they covered ground, but nothing substantial got done. Avoiding this trap requires awareness and discipline. It's not always about removing the small items, it's about containing them. Set time limits, bundle them together. Recognize when a group is getting too comfortable. When the same 3 people keep circling back to lunch vendors or office decor, call it out gently. Ask, what decision are we avoiding right now? That one question can reset the entire discussion. There's also value in assigning weight to agenda items ahead of time. Estimate impact, estimate risk. Give airtime to topics in proportion to their importance. Don't let the simplest problems hijack the conversation just because everyone has an opinion. Most importantly, notice how it feels when you fall into this trap. There's a kind of easy energy when everyone's debating surface-level stuff. It feels smooth, it feels cooperative. But pay attention to what's not being said. If there's tension beneath the surface, if people are holding back or rushing past the hard parts, that's the signal. That's the knot you should pull. The law of triviality isn't just a quirky group behavior. It's a symptom of avoidance. It's a sign that something harder, more important, and more complex is being ignored. And until someone has the courage to steer the group back to that harder thing, the bike shed keeps getting taller, shinier, and more irrelevant. Sometimes we say yes when we should say no, not because it's right, but because we feel sorry for someone. Sympathy bias slips in quietly. It doesn't shout, it doesn't argue. It simply tugs at our sense of compassion and changes the way we see things. When we make decisions based on how much we like someone or how much we feel bad for them, instead of relying on logic or facts, we fall into this trap. You see it all the time. A manager keeps an underperforming employee on the team, even after repeated warnings and missed deadlines. She knows he's not pulling his weight, but she also knows his personal story. He's going through a divorce, he's struggling with childcare, he's soft-spoken, seems fragile. Firing him would feel cruel. So she doesn't do it. Instead, she lets him stay on while others carry the load. Morale drops, productivity suffers, the whole team pays the price. Sympathy bias doesn't just affect managers. It shows up in everyday choices too. A teacher gives a passing grade to a student who hasn't earned it because the student has been through a hard year. A hiring committee chooses the more likable candidate over the more qualified one because the qualified one came off a bit stiff in the interview. A friend keeps lending money to someone who never pays it back because that person always tells a sad story. These aren't outliers. They're regular choices made under the weight of emotion. The problem is that sympathy feels noble. It tells us we're being kind. But sympathy isn't always kindness when it's placed ahead of fairness or sound reasoning. In fact, it can be the opposite. When you make a decision because someone seems pitiful or likable, you're no longer evaluating the issue at hand. You're reacting to a feeling, not a fact. And that feeling is often based on surface-level impressions, how someone looks, how they talk, or what part of their story they choose to share. Sympathy bias is different from empathy. Empathy is about understanding. You can empathize with someone and still make a hard decision. Sympathy, in contrast, leans toward rescuing. It wants to soothe discomfort, often your own, by avoiding choices that feel harsh. And it tricks you into believing you're doing good, even when you're avoiding responsibility. It happens in the justice system. Juries may let someone off with a lighter sentence because they seem remorseful or because their background story is tragic. The facts of the case don't change, but the emotional weight clouds objectivity. The same happens in business. Leaders sometimes hold back from giving honest feedback because they don't want to hurt someone's feelings. That hesitation, though, can deny the person a real chance to improve. Shielding someone from discomfort might feel like protection, but in the long run, it can stunt growth and reinforce poor habits. Let's take another example. A nonprofit is hiring for a critical position. They receive dozens of applications. One candidate stands out, not because of her experience, but because of the cover letter. It talks about financial struggles, caring for aging parents, overcoming obstacles. The story tugs at the heart. The hiring manager reads it twice. It feels wrong not to give her a chance. The interview goes okay, but not great. Another candidate is clearly stronger. Still, they pick the first one. Weeks later, performance issues begin. Deadlines are missed. Tasks need redoing. There's tension. But now, because the hiring manager acted out of sympathy, the team is carrying the weight of that decision. This doesn't mean we become cold or shut off emotion. It means we learn to pause when emotion shows up. We step back and ask, am I making this decision because it's the right one, or because I'm trying to avoid discomfort? Sympathy bias feeds on our need to feel good about ourselves. But integrity in decision-making doesn't always feel good in the moment. Sometimes it feels hard, uncomfortable, even unfair, yet it creates a foundation that holds up over time. Consider healthcare. A doctor may be tempted to prescribe unnecessary antibiotics because a patient insists. The patient looks tired, sounds miserable, and says, "Please, just give me something that works." The doctor knows the illness is viral. Antibiotics won't help. But the pressure is real. Denying someone who's suffering doesn't feel good. Still, a responsible doctor resists the pull of sympathy. They explain the truth clearly and stand by it, knowing the alternative, overprescription, harms public health. In leadership, sympathy bias often disguises itself as compassion. A leader may keep avoiding tough conversations because they don't want to upset anyone. They want to be seen as supportive, approachable, kind. But what actually happens is the organization drifts. Poor performers stay in place. Top performers get discouraged. The culture shifts from accountability to avoidance. And ironically, the people the leader wanted to protect may end up harmed the most. You can feel sorry for someone and still hold them accountable. You can care about someone and still tell them the truth. It's not unkind to do what's necessary. It's not cruel to say no when no is what the situation calls for. The real danger is when we think kindness and avoidance are the same thing. They're not. Let's not confuse warmth with wisdom. Decisions, especially important ones, need structure. They need criteria. And they need distance from emotion just long enough to see clearly. Sympathy bias doesn't show up waving a red flag. It comes softly through the language of guilt, pity, and hesitation. You'll feel it in the back of your mind when you think, I just don't want to be the bad guy. That voice isn't your guide, it's your warning. When it speaks, slow down. Ask yourself what standard you're applying. Would you make the same choice if this person weren't involved? Would you decide differently if the emotional pull weren't there? If the answer is yes, then sympathy may be doing the thinking for you. Keep the heart open, but let the head lead. You feel calm now, but that calm version of you has no clue what angry you might do. That's the trap. What psychologists call the hot-cold empathy gap. It's a common mistake people make, where they misjudge how much their emotional state influences their decisions. When you're relaxed, you think you'll stay rational in any situation. When you're angry, you swear that nothing could talk you down. But you're wrong both times. The hot state, anger, stress, hunger, lust, fear, doesn't just influence your choices, it can hijack your thinking entirely. And the worst part is, when you're not in that state, your brain acts like it doesn't exist. Take this example. You're sitting at home, full from dinner, browsing the grocery app. You add all the healthy stuff to your cart, vegetables, lean proteins, no junk food. You feel proud of yourself. But the next day, you're walking through the actual store, tired from work, a little stressed, and you haven't eaten since noon. Suddenly, the chips aisle looks different. Your earlier self didn't plan for this version of you. You grab the chips, maybe a pint of ice cream. That gap between who you were last night and who you are now. That's the empathy gap. The same thing happens in arguments. Let's say you're in a relationship. Everything's fine. You're feeling good, and your partner brings up something that bothered them. You nod, say, "If I ever do that again, just tell me. I'll stay calm, we'll talk it out." You mean it. But when it actually happens, maybe after a long day or when you're already annoyed, you feel attacked. You snap back. You forget the agreement. Later, when you're calm again, you feel confused about why you reacted that way. It's not just a mood swing. It's that your cold state brain failed to predict your hot state behavior. This gap affects more than just food or arguments. It shows up in addiction. Someone trying to quit smoking might throw away their pack, tell their friends, feel ready. But then stress hits, an overwhelming day, a bad memory, some social pressure. That craving flares up like fire. In the cold state, they had clarity. But in the hot state, the brain sees relief in the habit, not logic. It doesn't even feel like a decision anymore. It feels like survival. This trap also explains a lot of risky behavior. Think about teens or young adults planning a party. They might say, "We'll drink a little, but no one's getting blackout. If someone gets too drunk, we'll cut them off." That's all cold state reasoning. Once the music's loud, the drinks are flowing, and peer pressure kicks in, the hot state takes over. That careful plan dissolves. What felt easy to control before now feels impossible to resist. Even parents fall into this. A dad might say, "I never want to yell at my kid. I'll stay patient." He truly believes that when he's well rested and the house is quiet. But when he's late for work, the kid refuses to put on shoes and the coffee spills. He shouts, not because he's a bad parent, but because the version of him who made the no yelling rule doesn't exist in that moment. That version didn't account for the stress hormones, the sensory overload, or the time crunch. The gap was too wide. The same goes for people who promise to exercise every morning. At night, they set the alarm, lay out their clothes, and feel motivated. But come morning, the warm bed feels too good. The brain whispers excuses, and they hit snooze. They're not lazy. They just didn't realize that tired, cold, half-asleep version of them isn't on the same team as the night planner. That's the empathy gap again. In public health, this shows up with things like safe sex or drug use. A person might say, "I'd never have unprotected sex," or "I'd never use a dirty needle." But when they're in the middle of an intense emotional or physical moment, drunk, high, or desperate, that clear thinking vanishes. Their earlier judgment feels distant, irrelevant, like it belonged to someone else. Afterwards, they wonder why they acted out of character. But it was in character, just a different version of them. Marketers use this too. Ever notice how stores place candy and snacks right by the checkout? That's not random. They know you're already tired of decision-making by that point. You're probably a little hungry, maybe a little frustrated from waiting. You're in a mild hot state. That's when you're most likely to say yes to something you wouldn't normally buy. If you walked into the store with that same item sitting in the first aisle, you'd probably skip it. People also misjudge how pain or fear will affect them. Someone might say, "I'd never confess to something I didn't do," but they've never been in an interrogation room for 12 hours without sleep. The cold, confident version of them thinks rationality will win. But fear and fatigue push the brain into survival mode. People confess to things they didn't do, agree to bad deals, or lash out just to escape the pressure. It's not weakness, it's the hot-cold gap again. There's also a flip side. People in hot states can't imagine how they'll feel later. A person feeling depressed can't picture a time when they won't feel that way. They may even think, "I've always been this way," or "this will never pass." They forget that emotions move, that mental states shift. That's the gap working in reverse, where the hot version can't imagine calm ever returning. And that's dangerous because it can lead to hopelessness, which stops people from asking for help or even surviving the moment. So what can you do? Awareness helps, but it's not a magic fix. You need to build systems that work despite the empathy gap. That might mean setting hard rules while you're in a calm state, like "I won't bring junk food into the house," or "I'll only respond to serious messages after 10 minutes. It might mean writing notes to your future self, setting alarms with reminders like "you wanted to do this," or telling a friend, "If I ever say I want to quit, remind me why." You plan for the hot state in advance because you know you won't think straight once it arrives. This is also why good therapy and support groups matter. They create accountability and reflection when you're back in a calm state. You can look at the hot behavior with clarity, not shame, not excuses, but with strategy. You can learn the patterns. You start to say, "When I feel this way, I tend to do that," and you can build plans around it. But it all starts with admitting that your current state of mind is temporary. You are not always calm. You are not always angry. You are not always rational. Your mind shifts. If you forget that, the gap will trip you every time. Someone collapses on the sidewalk. You stand just feet away, watching. You're not the only one. There's a crowd. Dozens of people stand still, eyes fixed on the same scene. You wait. So do they. No one steps in. You think someone else will help, but they're thinking the same thing. This is the bystander effect at work. The bystander effect happens when people are less likely to help in emergencies if others are present. It's not about cruelty or lack of concern. It's about diffusion of responsibility. The more people around, the less any one person feels responsible. The sense of personal duty weakens in a crowd. Each person assumes someone else will take action. The phenomenon became widely known after a crime in New York City in 1964. A woman named Kitty Genovese was attacked outside her apartment building. News reports claim dozens of neighbors heard her screams and saw parts of the attack, but no one called the police or stepped in. The story shocked the public. Though later reports revealed some inaccuracies, the case still triggered a wave of research into how people behave in group situations. Psychologists John Darley and Bib Latané ran a series of experiments to study this. In one study, participants were placed alone or in a group. They were told they were part of a discussion over an intercom system. During the talk, a voice, a confederate in the experiment, would simulate having a seizure. When participants thought they were the only ones hearing the emergency, most helped. When they believed others could also hear it, fewer took action, and they took longer to do it. The conclusion was simple. The presence of others changes how responsible we feel. You might think this only happens in big emergencies, but it doesn't have to be life-threatening. Someone might drop a stack of papers in a hallway. One person sees it and helps. 10 people see it, and they all walk by. The moment becomes shared, but responsibility doesn't. That disconnect causes inaction. In a classroom, a teacher asks a question. No one answers, even though several students know it. Each one hesitates, unsure whether to speak. They wait. Others wait too. Silence stretches. No one wants to stand out. In groups, people look to each other for cues on how to act. If no one reacts, the group sets a quiet norm. Do nothing. Even in professional settings, this plays out. During a meeting, someone makes an offensive comment. A few people notice. No one speaks up. Afterward, in private, everyone agrees it was out of line. But during the moment, in that shared silence, the burden to speak feels diffused. No one wants to step forward first. The fear of acting alone keeps people frozen. The bystander effect doesn't always stem from apathy. It often comes from uncertainty. People hesitate when they're unsure what's happening or what the right response should be. In a crowd, that hesitation grows. If others don't react, it creates a false signal that everything is fine. Psychologists call this pluralistic ignorance, when people misread a situation because everyone else seems unbothered. They think, maybe it's not as serious as it looks. That misreading stops people from acting. A person who collapses on a sidewalk might seem like they're just resting. A strange noise might be brushed off as a joke. If no one else reacts, we doubt our own judgment. The crowd becomes a mirror, but it reflects indecision. There's also fear of embarrassment. What if you're wrong? What if you rush over and the person is fine? What if someone else already called for help? That hesitation costs time. The stakes are high in emergencies, but the social pressure to not overreact can be stronger than the drive to step in, especially when the crowd grows. The size of the group matters. The more people present, the stronger the bystander effect. In small groups, people feel more accountable. In larger crowds, that sense dissolves. You feel anonymous. You don't know anyone else, and they don't know you. That anonymity makes it easier to disengage emotionally. If no one notices you not acting, there's less internal pressure to step forward. The bystander effect doesn't mean people lack empathy. In fact, people often feel distressed when witnessing someone in trouble, but they don't convert that distress into action if they think others will handle it. Empathy becomes paralyzed, and because each bystander sees others doing nothing, the emotional weight spreads thinly. It's there, but no one owns it. Not all group inaction is conscious. The process happens quickly. You see the event, you glance around, no one moves. You hesitate, others hesitate too. Seconds pass, the moment closes, you walk on. Breaking the trap often requires something simple: eye contact. Research shows that when someone in need looks directly at a bystander and asks for help, the chances of getting it rise sharply. That personal connection snaps the diffusion. It assigns responsibility directly. The abstract becomes specific. In one experiment, a man pretended to collapse in a subway station. When he lay there silently, fewer people helped. But when he made eye contact and asked one person, "Can you help me?" the response rate jumped. That moment of direct appeal made a difference. The illusion of shared responsibility disappeared. Training can also reduce the bystander effect. Emergency responders, for example, learn to assess situations quickly and act decisively. They're trained to take charge. In first aid courses, instructors often teach bystanders to give direct commands. You call 911. That specificity helps. It prevents the hesitation that spreads in crowds. Social norms matter too. In communities where helping behavior is visible and common, people are more likely to step in. It becomes part of the culture. But in places where everyone assumes someone else will act, inaction becomes the norm. Silence spreads, not because people don't care, but because they fear stepping out of line. It helps to ask, what if I were the one in need? What would I want others to do? That shift in perspective makes the situation personal again. It puts responsibility back on the individual level, where action begins. In digital spaces, the bystander effect shows up in different forms. On social media, when someone posts about being in distress, responses vary. If the post gets a lot of views but few comments, it creates the illusion that people don't care. But often, viewers assume someone else will respond, or they feel unsure what to say. The silence feels louder online. The screen adds another layer of distance. The sense of urgency gets lost in the scroll. When everyone is responsible, no one is. That's the trap. The bystander effect makes people passive observers, even when they care deeply. It doesn't take malice, just silence, just stillness. A second of hesitation can be enough to do nothing. And when everyone hesitates together, it becomes a choice made by no one, but shared by all. There's no single cure, but awareness helps. Recognizing the trap is the first way out of it. Knowing that your hesitation is common doesn't make it easier, but it does make it familiar. It gives you the option to override it, to act anyway, even when no one else does. You can step out of the crowd. You can choose to help, not because you're heroic, but because you understand the cost of waiting. You think they know what you're feeling. You believe it shows in your face, in your voice, in your body. You're nervous before a presentation, and you assume everyone sees it. You're unsure during a conversation, and you're convinced the other person hears your uncertainty. But the truth is, most people have no clue. They aren't reading your thoughts. They're not picking up on your emotional state nearly as well as you think. This is called the illusion of transparency, and it quietly distorts how you move through the world. This psychological trap happens when we overestimate how visible our internal experiences are to others. You might feel your heart racing, your palms sweating, or your voice trembling. To you, those signals are loud. They feel obvious. You believe people can hear the hesitation in your tone or see the guilt on your face, but they can't. In fact, studies show that most people are too busy with their own internal chatter to notice subtle shifts in others, especially when those shifts aren't directly expressed. Let's take a common example. You forget someone's name during a conversation. Inside your mind, there's a full-blown alarm going off. You're sweating it, feeling awkward, playing mental gymnastics to avoid having to say their name. You believe your discomfort is written all over you. But from the outside, the person probably just sees you nodding along, looking thoughtful. Unless you visibly panic or give something away, they likely have no idea. That's the illusion. You feel exposed, but you're not. It works the other way, too. Think about lying. You might tell a harmless lie, maybe to avoid hurting someone's feelings. Let's say a friend asks if you liked their cooking, and you didn't, but you say it was good. As you speak, you're convinced you sound fake. You think your face gave it away. You're certain your voice betrayed your true feelings. But chances are, your friend accepts your words at face value. They're not scanning your tone or reading your micro-expressions like a detective. They're hearing what you say and moving on. The illusion of transparency becomes more intense in high-stakes situations. Public speaking is a common trigger. You stand in front of a crowd and your chest tightens. You feel like everyone can see your hands shake. You're convinced your voice is cracking, your nerves are obvious, and the audience knows you're struggling. But most people watching have no idea what's going on inside you. To them, you might come off as quiet, thoughtful, or even confident. That's not just wishful thinking. It's been tested. In one study, researchers asked participants to give speeches. Afterward, the speakers rated how nervous they thought they looked. The audience then rated how nervous the speakers appeared. Over and over, speakers believed they looked far more nervous than the audience actually perceived. The gap between self-perception and outside observation was wide and consistent. This is the illusion in action. You assume your inner world leaks out, but it usually stays inside. Even when you're trying to be honest or vulnerable, this bias can create confusion. Let's say you're upset with someone, but you don't want to start a fight. You hope they'll notice your mood, your short responses, your lack of eye contact, the way you sigh between sentences. You think you're making it obvious that something's wrong. But unless you say it directly, they probably won't catch on. And if they do, they may misread the reason. You were hoping for understanding. Instead, you get misunderstanding, or worse, nothing at all. That mismatch happens because of the illusion of transparency. This trap can create tension in relationships, both personal and professional. One person assumes the other should know what they're feeling. The other person, unaware, moves on as usual. The gap between expectation and reality widens. Over time, that gap becomes resentment. You start to feel like people don't listen, don't care, or don't notice your needs. But often the truth is more neutral. They just didn't know. You never said it. You thought they could tell, but they couldn't. In workplaces, this illusion can mess with feedback. A manager might think they've been clear about dissatisfaction with an employee's performance. They've made a few vague comments or asked leading questions. They believe the employee must know what's going on. But unless they clearly say, "Here's what's not working," that feedback might never land. The employee remains unaware. The manager grows more frustrated. Performance doesn't improve. This slow burn continues because one person thinks they're being obvious, while the other doesn't pick up on anything. On the flip side, people often feel like they're giving away too much when they don't want to. You might tell a joke at someone's expense, then immediately feel awkward. You believe everyone can see your guilt. You convince yourself the whole room knows you crossed a line. But it's likely nobody noticed, or if they did, they didn't assign the same meaning to your reaction that you did. The feeling of exposure is real to you, but it's usually invisible to others. This also shows up in negotiation. Someone might think they're hiding how much they want a deal. Inside, they're sweating and second-guessing their every word. They assume the other party sees through them. But the person across the table is guessing just like they are. Both sides might be sitting there overanalyzing, both believing the other has more insight or better control. The illusion makes you believe you're broadcasting your weaknesses. In reality, you're just quietly existing in your own head. So what's the cost of this illusion? Anxiety, mostly. You waste mental energy trying to manage how you think others see you. You replay conversations, overanalyze glances, and adjust your behavior based on imaginary transparency. You might become overly guarded, trying not to leak too much. Or you might get frustrated when people don't respond to your feelings, even though you never voiced them. The problem isn't that others are heartless or inattentive. The problem is that you're expecting them to see things they can't. You're treating your thoughts and emotions as public signals when they're actually private. Until you name them, they're hidden. There's also a social cost. The illusion can create emotional distance. When you believe others know what you're feeling, you might feel let down when they don't respond the way you hoped. That disappointment builds. It turns into stories. They don't care. They never listen. They ignored me. But what if they just didn't know? Breaking out of the illusion of transparency doesn't mean you have to spell everything out at all times. It just means you become more aware of what people don't see. It means understanding that if you need someone to know how you feel, you probably need to say it. If you're worried that your anxiety is obvious, it's probably not. And if you're hoping someone understands your silence, they probably don't. The mind assumes it's on display, but most of the time it's still behind the curtain. We think we're an open book, but really, we're a locked diary no one's been given permission to read. You think you're choosing freely, but you're not. You're being steered, and most of the time you don't even notice it. Let's say you're standing in a coffee shop looking at the menu. There are two sizes, small for $3 and large for $6. You think it through. Maybe the small is enough. The large seems a bit much, both in size and price. You're on the fence. But then there's a third option, medium for $5. Now suddenly, the large seems like a deal. For just $1 more, you get more coffee. The decision feels easy now. You choose the large. What just happened? That was the decoy effect in action. This is a trap where a third, less attractive option is introduced, not to be chosen, but to nudge you toward a specific choice. It's not there to be picked. It's bait, a silent influencer that shifts your attention without touching your awareness. This works because we don't evaluate things in isolation. We compare, we weigh, and often we look for the option that feels like the smart choice between extremes. The decoy gives us that contrast, but it's an illusion of logic. The choice feels rational, but it's preloaded with bias. Let's break it down with a more everyday example. You're shopping for headphones. 2 models catch your eye. One is $99, basic, no noise cancellation, decent brand. The other is $199, top of the line, all the features, long battery life. You're hesitant. Is it worth the extra $100? Then you see a third option right in the middle, $189. It has fewer features than the $199 model and not much better than the $99 one. It's not appealing, but it makes the $199 pair look like a steal. Suddenly, you feel good about spending more because it feels like you're getting value. That's the trap. The $189 option wasn't there to win. It was designed to lose. And in losing, it makes the $199 choice win by comparison. Your decision didn't come from your needs. It came from the structure of the options laid in front of you. This plays out across industries. Restaurants do it with wine lists. Movie theaters do it with popcorn sizes. Software companies do it with subscription tiers. Think of those basic, standard, and premium plans. Often, the middle one exists solely to make the premium look more appealing. People tend to avoid the cheapest because they associate it with low quality, but they also hesitate to go for the highest tier, unless it's framed just right. Enter the decoy. It's positioned so that the high-tier option looks like the smart move. Not extravagant, just reasonable. Marketers understand that we don't always know what we want until we see it in comparison. The decoy creates a contrast that's hard to ignore. It highlights a target option without ever calling attention to itself. Now here's where it gets more subtle. This doesn't just happen in shopping. It happens in decision-making everywhere. Hiring decisions, political candidates, even dating. Let's say you're hiring someone. 2 candidates look solid. One is sharp and experienced. The other is creative and adaptive. You're torn. Then a third resume comes in. This one lacks direction, looks a bit scattered, and isn't as skilled. But they have a background similar to the creative candidate. Suddenly, the creative one stands out more. The weak third option made the second one look better. You feel confident about picking them, not because they changed, but because the comparison did. Same principle. Let's look at a dating app. You swipe through profiles. You see 2 people who stand out. One is smart and funny, the other is calm and kind. Then comes a third. They share traits with the funny one, but less attractive and not as engaging. Oddly, the funny one now seems like the right call. You didn't know what you preferred until the contrast showed up. The third profile acted as a mirror, not a match. It doesn't matter if we're picking products or people. The decoy works because our minds latch onto relativity. We judge things based on what's around them, not by their absolute value. And most of the time, this happens so quickly that we skip over the fact that we've been nudged. It's important to see this for what it is, a form of manipulation. Not always harmful, but always strategic. Whoever sets up the choices often already knows which one they want you to pick. The decoy helps guide you there without needing to say a word. Now you might wonder, can we avoid it? Is there a way to not fall for it? You can't always see the setup coming, but you can slow down. When you're faced with 3 options and one seems oddly unappealing, ask yourself, is this third choice really meant to be chosen, or is it just making one of the others look better? Look beyond the surface. Try comparing the top 2 options without the decoy. Strip it down. Ask, would I still prefer this if the third one wasn't here? If the answer shifts, you're probably being influenced more than you think. Some people think this only happens in high-stakes settings, business deals, politics, branding. But it's more ordinary than that. You might see it when choosing a gym membership, picking a streaming service, or buying a kitchen appliance. The decoy is subtle because it needs to be. If it's too obvious, it loses power. That's what makes it a trap. It doesn't trick you with false facts. It tricks you with framing. It rearranges what you see until one choice starts to shine and the others fade. You walk away thinking you made a smart choice, but the choice was already set up to feel smart, and that's the art of the decoy. Not to win, but to make something else win by contrast. Not to stand out, but to stand beside the right thing and quietly do its work. Now, next time you're in front of 3 options and one of them feels like a dud, pause. Look twice. The choice you're about to make might not be yours alone. You see a photo of a child who needs urgent help. Her name is Sarah. She's 7 years old, and her house just got wiped out in a flood. Something about her face sticks with you. Her eyes are wide. She's clinging to a soaked teddy bear. You feel it. This deep tug in your gut. You want to do something. You might even pull out your phone to donate or share the story. Now contrast that with a headline: flood displaces 10,000 people across multiple villages. That's a bigger tragedy. The damage is worse, the suffering greater. But chances are, you don't feel the same pull. You probably scroll past it. You might pause for a second. Maybe you think it's sad, but it doesn't cut through in the same way. That's the identifiable victim effect in action. It's the tendency we all have to feel more empathy, urgency, and willingness to help when we're shown a single specific person instead of a group. Even if that group is suffering more. Even if the need is greater. It sounds irrational, and it is, but it's deeply human. This response isn't new. It's not something that came with the internet or modern media. Researchers have studied it for decades. One of the clearest demonstrations came from a study where participants were shown 2 scenarios. One group learned about a young girl in Africa who was starving. She had a name, there was a photo, they were told where she lived and what she needed. Another group got statistics, big numbers, charts, facts about widespread famine. The people who saw the girl donated almost twice as much money. The effect held up even when the statistics showed a far worse situation. People still gave more when there was just one person, a face, a name. This doesn't mean we're heartless. It means we're wired to connect on a human level. Large numbers blur together. One face breaks through. We don't picture 10,000 people. We don't feel 50,000 hungry children. But we can picture Sarah. We can worry about her. We can imagine what she's going through because we've seen kids like her, or we've been kids like her. This creates problems in how we respond to large-scale suffering. Aid organizations know this. That's why campaigns often focus on a single child or individual story. They're not manipulating you. They're working with human psychology. They know what gets you to care, and more importantly, what gets you to act. The media does this too, often without even realizing it. News stories lead with the most emotionally compelling angle. A mother loses her baby in a bombing. That will be the headline, even if the bombing killed hundreds. The individual story carries more emotional weight. It's more likely to be shared. It gets clicks. It gets airtime. But this bias also means people and situations that aren't relatable or media-friendly get less help. Entire populations can be overlooked. A war without clear heroes or victims may vanish from public interest. A slow-moving crisis, like a drought or a mass migration, doesn't break through unless someone finds a face to put on it. We also see this effect outside of humanitarian causes. Think of crime. One high-profile murder with a name and a backstory can spark national outrage, protests, policy changes. Meanwhile, other killings, especially when grouped into stats, barely make the news. Even if the numbers are higher, even if the harm is ongoing. It happens in politics too. A single person who falls through the cracks of a healthcare system can become a symbol, leading to legislation and reform. But statistics about the thousands who struggle quietly often aren't enough. They don't stick in the mind. They don't hit the same nerve. This is a trap, not because empathy is bad, but because our empathy is uneven. It's selective. And sometimes it leads us away from helping in the most effective way. There's another layer to this, the drop-in-the-bucket effect. If people believe their help won't make a difference to a large group, they're less likely to act. But if they believe they can save one life, just one, they often will, even if helping that one means ignoring many others. It's not just about scale, it's about perception. One clear story makes you feel powerful. It makes the problem seem solvable. You know exactly what your money or your help will do. But when you're looking at a crisis in the millions, it's easy to feel numb, overwhelmed, helpless. Some people try to resist this trap with logic. They call it effective altruism, a way of giving that focuses on outcomes and impact. They use data to decide where help goes. But even those folks often admit how hard it is to act against their feelings. The single face still pulls harder than the spreadsheet. There's also a risk in reverse. If a single person's story turns out to be false or exaggerated, people start distrusting the cause, even if the broader issue is real. That's the downside of hinging a message on one face. It creates all the emotion, but also all the pressure. Psychologists say this trap has roots in evolution. In early human groups, we mostly cared about people we could see, touch, and talk to. Our survival depended on it. We're good at reading individual pain. We're built to help the person next to us. We never evolved for empathy on a global scale. Modern life throws that into chaos. We're shown thousands of faces, thousands of stories, every day. Our brains weren't designed for this kind of exposure. So we narrow our focus, we latch onto one. That's why fundraisers use names. That's why ads show you a single dog at the shelter, not a kennel full of them. That's why a local missing person grips your town more than a mass tragedy overseas. It's not a moral failing, but it is a distortion. When you know about the identifiable victim effect, you start seeing it everywhere. You catch yourself caring more when there's a face. You notice how quickly your attention fades when there's only a number. Awareness doesn't erase the trap, but it does give you options. You can pause. You can ask yourself, am I reacting to one story or am I responding to the actual need? You can train your mind to look beyond the face and see the full picture, not to stop caring, but to care smarter. You help a friend move. It takes hours. Your back hurts, your shirt is soaked in sweat, and you skip your plans for the night. You feel good about it. You should. But then something strange happens. That same night, you snap at your roommate. The next day, you skip your shift at a volunteer gig. You catch yourself thinking, I've done enough. I deserve a break. That's the moral credential effect. This trap creeps in quietly. It tells you that one good action buys you moral credit. It's like a psychological point system in your head. You do something right, something decent, and without even noticing it, you give yourself permission to do something that goes against your own values. It's not always obvious. Sometimes it's subtle. You bend the truth, you let something slide, you justify a selfish decision, and all because you think you've earned it. The danger here isn't in doing good things. It's in how your brain banks those things, then spends them on actions you'd normally see as wrong. Researchers first picked up on this pattern in studies about prejudice. People who endorsed statements about racial equality were more likely to favor a white candidate over a black candidate in a job hiring scenario if they had first proven their lack of bias. Their earlier stance acted like a psychological shield. It made them feel secure in their moral identity, and that sense of moral safety gave them permission to act in a way that contradicted it. This isn't just about big social issues. It shows up in everyday life. Let's say someone donates to a cause. They feel proud, and they should, but then they start treating people around them with less patience. They might be rude to customer service. They might gossip more freely. There's this subtle voice saying, "You're one of the good ones. You've done your part." That voice is the trap. It also explains why people who give a lot of public attention to doing good can sometimes act with private selfishness. Think of the boss who donates heavily to charity but treats employees like they're disposable, or the politician who pushes ethics reform while cheating on their taxes. It's not always hypocrisy. Sometimes it's that inner ledger. They believe their good deeds earn them a cushion, a license to misstep. One of the reasons this trap is so effective is because it taps into our identity. Once you see yourself as a good person, someone who helps, someone who supports, someone who stands up for what's right, you naturally want to protect that image. But if you're not careful, you'll mistake the image for the whole story. You'll start seeing good deeds as proof of goodness, not reflections of it. That difference matters, because once you're in that mindset, it's hard to hold yourself accountable. If you lie, you say, well, I'm not a liar. I just didn't want to hurt their feelings. If you cut corners, you say, I work harder than most people. I've earned this shortcut. Slowly, your behavior becomes less about the moment and more about the story you're telling yourself. The story that you're still a good person, no matter what you just did. That story can cover a lot of ground. This also affects how we respond to criticism. If someone calls out your behavior after you've done something good, you might feel insulted, defensive. How could they say that after all I've done? That reaction comes from the same place. You believe your moral history should exempt you from moral scrutiny, but it doesn't. Not really. Let's pull it into a different example. Say you're in a relationship. You've been kind. You've gone out of your way to be supportive. One day you lose your temper. You say something cruel. Instead of apologizing, you remind yourself of all the things you've done for that person. It becomes a shield. You start thinking, they should understand. I've always been there for them. That's not wrong, but it also doesn't undo the damage. Good actions don't buy immunity. They don't erase harm. This effect can also show up in group settings. Companies run into it all the time. A brand supports a social cause, maybe changes its logo or funds a campaign. That's good, but then it uses that goodwill to deflect future criticism. It ignores internal problems. It delays reform. It says, we've proven our values already. Customers, employees, the public, they're expected to trust the brand based on its past deeds. But moral currency doesn't accumulate like money. You can't spend it later to offset future mistakes. The trickiest part about the moral credential effect is how invisible it is while it's happening. You won't always notice the shift. You'll feel proud of what you did, something kind, something generous, something brave. Then later, in an entirely different moment, you'll let yourself off the hook. You'll act in a way that doesn't align. You won't even connect the two moments. But they are connected. Psychologists say this happens because of how we think about morality. We often treat it like a fixed identity. We want to see ourselves as good, and we use past actions to confirm that image. So when we make a mistake, we don't look at it clearly. We explain it away. We tell ourselves, that's not who I am. Look at everything else I've done. And that logic feels honest. It feels fair. But it isn't always. A better way to think about it is this. Your values aren't something you earn once. They're something you keep choosing, over and over. Doing something good doesn't buy you a break from being decent. It doesn't give you a moral hall pass. It proves you're capable, and now you're responsible for holding that line, even when no one's watching. That means staying aware of your own ledger. If you catch yourself justifying something shady by pointing to something good you did last week, stop. Think. Ask yourself if you'd excuse that same behavior from someone else. Ask yourself if the justification would hold up if the roles were reversed. If the answer is no, you're probably walking into the trap. The solution isn't to stop doing good things. It's to stop turning those things into permission slips. Don't let your own decency become an excuse to look the other way when you fall short. Don't use kindness as a cover. Don't let pride in past actions cloud your present decisions. That's the moral credential effect. Quiet, subtle, but strong enough to twist how you see yourself and how you behave when no one's keeping score.